Introduction. Too much wisdom. How should we live? What path should we choose? And what kind of people should we strive to become? In the modern era, answers to these profound questions are everywhere. We are inundated with advice, maxims and aphorisms printed on calendars, hidden inside tea bags, stamped under bottle caps, and forwarded in endless chains of well-meaning electronic messages. It is as if we are wandering through Jorge Luis Borges's legendary Library of Babel, a sprawling, infinite repository containing every possible combination of letters. Somewhere within those endless shelves lies the definitive explanation of existence and the perfect manual for how to navigate it. Yet the librarians suspect that the truth will forever remain lost amidst miles of incoherence. Fortunately, our reality is less bleak than Borges's labyrinth. Much of the guidance that surrounds us is not nonsense at all. Rather, it is fundamentally true. However, because our access to information is effectively limitless and our time is agonizingly brief, we are confronted with the paradox of abundance. When there is too much to consume, the sheer volume diminishes the quality of our engagement. Surrounded by a magnificent feast of human knowledge, we fall into the habit of grazing, skimming pages, or merely glancing at summaries. We may have already stumbled upon the greatest, most transformative insight in human history, but because we failed to pause, internalize it, and actively weave it into the fabric of our lives, it passed us by without leaving a mark. This journey is an invitation to pause and deeply savor 10 profound ideas. Each of these ideas represents a psychological truth that was uncovered by ancient civilizations, whether in the sacred texts of India, the philosophical traditions of China, or the classic cultures of the Mediterranean. Rather than merely cataloging these thoughts, the goal is to hold them up to the light of modern scientific research, interrogating them, refining them, and extracting the vital lessons that can genuinely improve our contemporary lives. The perspective guiding this exploration is rooted in the empirical study of human social life, specifically morality and moral emotions. In the process of teaching the vast landscape of psychology, a pattern began to emerge. Across the diverse fields of the human mind, from the basic structure of the nervous system to the intricate dynamics of love and attachment, certain foundational principles kept reappearing. More often than not, these principles had already been articulated with unmatched eloquence by the great thinkers of the past. When exploring how our interpretations shape our reality and our mental suffering, it is nearly impossible to state the phenomenon more perfectly than Shakespeare did when he observed that nothing is inherently good or bad, but our thinking makes it so. Such realizations sparked a quest through the annals of ancient wisdom, delving into the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, the Analects of Confucius, the Tao Te Ching, the texts of the Greco-Roman philosophers, and the foundational scriptures of the world's major religions. Every time a psychological claim about human nature or the workings of the heart appeared consistently across different eras and cultures, it was marked as a potential great idea. Yet, a mere list of widespread aphorisms lacks coherence. What is truly valuable is a sequence of ideas that build upon one another, forming a unified narrative about how human beings can cultivate meaning and flourish. This aligns precisely with the aims of positive psychology, the rigorous scientific pursuit of understanding what makes life worth living. The story unfolds by first examining the inherent structure of the human mind. To navigate life effectively, one must first recognize a fundamental division within the self. The mind is not a single, unified entity. It is divided into parts that frequently find themselves in conflict. Imagine the conscious, rational self as a rider perched atop a massive, powerful elephant. The rider holds the reins and attempts to steer, but his control is tenuous at best. The elephant, representing our automatic processes, deep-seated instincts, and emotional drives, has a will of its own. Modern psychology reveals the origins of this divide and offers practical strategies to help the rider and the elephant function harmoniously. Building upon this understanding of the divided self, we encounter the ancient insight that our life is the creation of our mind. We must confront the reality that our minds possess a natural, evolutionary bias toward negativity and anxiety. The elephant is wired to notice threats more readily than opportunities, yet by employing specific techniques, both ancient and profoundly modern, we can rewire these ingrained responses and significantly elevate our baseline of well-being. From the internal landscape, the narrative moves outward into our social existence. Two widely known but deeply underappreciated truths govern human relationships. The first is the undeniable power of reciprocity. The golden rule is not merely a moral aspiration. It is the fundamental currency of social interaction, a vital tool for cooperation, and a profound clue about our evolutionary heritage. However, our attempts to abide by this rule are constantly subverted by a second truth: our inherent hypocrisy. We possess psychological mechanisms that make us spectacularly adept at recognizing the flaws and biases in others while remaining blind to our own. Understanding the mechanics of our own self-righteousness is the first step toward dismantling it and reducing the bitter conflicts that plague our lives. With a clearer view of our minds and our social connections, we can confront the ultimate question: where does true happiness originate? A common hypothesis suggests that happiness is the reward for getting what we want, yet experience and research demonstrate that such satisfaction is fleeting. A more venerable hypothesis, championed by the Stoics and the Buddha, argues that happiness can only be found within, by severing our emotional attachments to the unpredictable external world and cultivating a state of pure acceptance. While this inward turn offers profound wisdom, modern evidence suggests it is incomplete. Some external things are genuinely worth striving for. The bonds we forge with others, the depth of our relatedness, and the quality of our love are external conditions that can create lasting fulfillment. Thus, the ancient hypothesis must be refined. Happiness comes from within, but it also comes from without. We require both ancient detachment and modern engagement to find the proper balance. The journey also requires examining the crucibles of human growth. We frequently hear that what does not kill us makes us stronger, but this is a dangerous oversimplification. Adversity can indeed foster profound post-traumatic growth, but it requires understanding when and why suffering yields wisdom and how we can navigate our inevitable traumas. Furthermore, the development of virtue, long championed by the ancients, must be re-evaluated. By understanding how moral concepts have shifted over the centuries, we can utilize the tools of positive psychology to actively diagnose and cultivate our own profound strengths. Finally, the narrative culminates in the search for meaning. Why do some lives feel infused with purpose while others feel empty? There is a culturally universal perception of a vertical spiritual dimension to human existence, a sense of nobility, divinity, or sacredness that transcends the mere physical world. By exploring the moral emotions of awe, elevation, and disgust, we can understand how this spiritual dimension operates and why it is central to the human quest for significance. The ultimate meaning of life is not a simple phrase to be memorized, but a state of harmony to be achieved. It involves discovering a purpose that transcends the self and aligning the rider, the elephant, and our environment. Wisdom, meaning, and insight may wash over us daily, but they are utterly useless unless we stop to savor them, engage with them, and deliberately integrate them into our existence. That is the true objective of this journey. Chapter 1. The Divided Self. Human understanding often relies heavily on the use of metaphors. When we encounter complex or abstract concepts, our instinct is to map them onto familiar, tangible experiences. For thousands of years, as human beings lived in close proximity to nature, the challenge of steering large, powerful animals provided a ready metaphor for the internal struggles of the human mind. The Buddha, for instance, likened his untamed desires to a wild elephant, noting that discipline acts as the trainer that eventually brings the beast into harmony. In ancient Greece, Plato described the soul as a chariot pulled by two distinctly different horses. One horse represents noble, honorable passions that respond to gentle verbal commands, while the other embodies base lusts and unruly appetites, requiring the whip and goad to be kept in line. The goal of a proper philosophical education, according to Plato, was to empower the charioteer, human reason, to command perfect authority over these opposing forces. Centuries later, Sigmund Freud offered a comparable framework. He conceptualized the mind as a precarious balancing act between three entities: the ego, the conscious, rational self; the superego, the rigid internalization of societal rules; and the id, the relentless drive for immediate pleasure. One might envision Freud's model as a horse-drawn carriage wherein the driver desperately tries to control a hungry, lustful horse, all while a passenger in the back continually berates the driver for every mistake. The objective of psychoanalysis was to strengthen the driver, allowing for greater mastery over the horse and independence from the harsh passenger. However, as the 20th century progressed and machinery replaced livestock, our metaphors shifted. Social scientists began comparing the mind to a computer program or a motor vehicle. We were modeled as perfectly rational agents, taking in data, processing it, and executing logical choices to achieve our goals. Yet this modern, sanitized model fails to explain a universal human experience, our profound capacity for irrationality and weakness of will. We resolve to diet, yet we succumb to dessert. We plan to wake up early, yet we repeatedly silence the alarm. We know exactly what is best for us in relationships or careers, yet we watch ourselves make choices that directly contradict our own rational advice. The ancient animal metaphors capture this internal fragmentation far better than any computer model. A more accurate and unifying image for our psychological landscape is that of a small rider sitting atop a massive elephant. The rider represents our conscious, verbal, and analytical mind. He holds the reins and can attempt to guide the elephant, but his authority is fragile. Whenever the elephant, representing our visceral instincts, automatic processes, and deep emotional drives, truly wants to move in a particular direction, the rider is hopelessly outmatched. To understand the human condition, we must first understand how our minds are divided into parts that frequently operate at cross purposes. We are not a single unified consciousness. We are more like a committee. This internal division manifests in 4 distinct ways. First division: mind versus body. Long before modern neurology, observers of human nature recognized that the body does not always obey the conscious mind. The 16th century philosopher Michel de Montaigne extensively documented the frustrating autonomy of our anatomy. He noted how facial expressions betray our hidden anxieties, how our hearts race against our will, and, quite candidly, how sexual organs and bowels often function with complete disregard for our conscious intentions. Today, science explains these phenomena through the autonomic nervous system, which operates independently to regulate our glands and organs. But the autonomy of the digestive tract is even more profound than Montaigne could have imagined. Our intestines are lined with an intricate network of over 100 million neurons, essentially functioning as a second brain. This gut brain manages the highly complex chemical refineries of digestion with little to no input from the primary brain in our skull. It possesses such a high degree of independence that it can continue to operate effectively even if the vagus nerve, the primary communication line between the gut and the head, is entirely severed. This second brain does not merely take orders, it asserts its own agenda. When it detects an infection, it can signal the head brain to produce feelings of anxiety or lethargy, altering our behavior to facilitate healing. It is highly sensitive to neurotransmitters like serotonin, which is why medications designed to alter mood in the head often produce unintended gastrointestinal side effects in the gut. This profound biological division, in which the lower body operates on its own complex logic, perfectly mirrors the ancient frustrations over the flesh warring against the spirit. Second division: left versus right. A more literal division of the mind was uncovered in the 1960s through a radical medical procedure to help patients suffering from severe, uncontrollable epileptic seizures. A surgeon named Joe Bogan severed the corpus callosum, the massive bundle of nerves connecting the left and right hemispheres of the brain. The logic was simple. By cutting the bridge, a seizure starting in one hemisphere could not spread to the other. Surprisingly, the patients recovered remarkably well and appeared largely unchanged. However, psychologist Michael Gazzaniga devised subtle experiments to reveal the hidden consequences of this split brain surgery. Because the left side of the brain processes information from the right half of the visual field and controls language, while the right side of the brain processes the left visual field and excels at spatial patterns, Gazzaniga could secretly feed information to just one half of a patient's brain. When Gazzaniga flashed an image, such as a hat, exclusively to the right hemisphere, the patient's language-dominant left hemisphere would honestly report seeing nothing. Yet, if asked to point to the correct image using the left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, the hand would point directly to the hat. It was as though a silent, independent intelligence was trapped inside the skull, communicating only through physical gestures. The implications grew even more astonishing when the two hemispheres were fed contradictory information. In one test, the right hemisphere was shown a snowy landscape, prompting the left hand to point to a picture of a snow shovel. Simultaneously, the left hemisphere was shown a chicken claw. When the researcher asked the patient to explain why his hand was pointing to a shovel, the left hemisphere did not admit ignorance. Instead, it instantly fabricated a plausible justification, claiming that a shovel was needed to clean out a chicken coop. This phenomenon, known as confabulation, demonstrates that the left hemisphere acts as an interpreter module. It constantly observes the behaviors generated by the rest of the brain and instantly weaves a coherent narrative to explain them, all while remaining completely blind to the true underlying causes. In rare cases, this disconnection results in alien hand syndrome, where one hand might actively fight the other, physically restraining the body from completing a conscious action. While normal people do not have severed brains, this research vividly proves that the mind is a confederation of distinct modules, and the part of us that speaks and rationalizes is highly skilled at inventing convincing fictions to explain our behavior. Third division, new vs old. To understand the third division, we must look at how the brain expanded over millions of years of evolution. The brain did not develop from a blank slate, it built outward from the spinal column. The earliest structures, the hindbrain and midbrain, were eventually augmented by a forebrain. Over time, early mammals developed a limbic system, a network of structures including the hypothalamus, hippocampus, and amygdala, which wrap around the older brain core and are heavily involved in emotional learning, memory, and basic drives. As social mammals evolved, particularly primates, a new outer layer developed, the neocortex. In humans, the front portion of this neocortex grew massively. This frontal cortex is associated with reasoning, planning, and freeing the organism from purely impulsive reactions. This evolutionary sequence has often given rise to a Promethean script. The flattering idea that primitive animalistic emotions reside in the old limbic system, while divine, rational thought was gracefully installed in the new frontal cortex. This script appeals to our desire to view ourselves as creatures of elevated intellect, struggling to control our inner beasts. However, modern neuroscience reveals that this script is fundamentally flawed. The expansion of the frontal cortex did not just grant us logic, it vastly expanded our emotional capacity. The lower region of the prefrontal cortex, situated just above the eyes, the orbitofrontal cortex, is exceptionally active during emotional responses. It rapidly assesses situations, computing the potential for pleasure or pain, and heavily influences our desire to approach or retreat. When patients suffer damage to this specific emotional center of the frontal cortex, they do not become hyper-rational beings freed from the distraction of feelings. Instead, as neurologist Antonio Damasio discovered, their lives unravel. Stripped of those immediate, emotional gut feelings about what is good or bad, these patients face a menu of endless options and possess no internal compass to guide their choices. They can analyze the pros and cons of an action infinitely, but they lack the emotional spark required to make a final decision. Human rationality is entirely dependent on a highly functional emotional system. The new brain did not replace the old, it intertwined with it. The rider of reason was created, but the elephant of emotion became infinitely more sophisticated. Fourth division, controlled versus automatic. The most critical division of the self, the one that best encapsulates the rider and the elephant, is the distinction between controlled and automatic processes. For decades, psychology treated the mind as an information processor, but in the 1990s, researchers demonstrated that the mind operates via two parallel tracks. Automatic processes govern nearly everything we do. They operate quickly, simultaneously, and entirely outside of conscious awareness. If you read a list of words related to old age, your automatic system subtly influences your behavior, causing you to walk slower without you ever realizing it. If subliminal words are flashed before your eyes, your automatic system registers them and alters your mood. Controlled processing, by contrast, is the slow, deliberate, step-by-step thinking that occurs exclusively in the spotlight of consciousness. It is severely limited, capable of handling only one complex thought at a time. To understand why the massive automatic system dominates the tiny controlled system, we must look at our evolutionary history. For hundreds of millions of years, animal brains evolved sophisticated automatic systems to navigate their environments, fight, mate, and forage. These automatic networks are ancient, rigorously tested by natural selection, and incredibly efficient. Controlled processing, which relies heavily on the use of language to analyze the past and plan for the future, arrived only in the last evolutionary instant. Language did not evolve to replace the automatic system, it evolved to assist it. The rider, controlled processing, was placed on the back of the elephant, automatic processing, not to rule it as a tyrant, but to serve as a highly useful advisor. Because the automatic system controls our dopamine responses, the chemical rewards for survival behaviors like eating and procreating, it operates on immediate gratification. The rider can attempt to counsel the elephant, warning it of long-term health risks or future social consequences, but the rider cannot simply command the elephant by force of will. Reason is, as the philosopher David Hume suggested, the servant of the passions, failures of self-control. The profound imbalance of power between the rider and the elephant becomes glaringly apparent when we attempt to exercise self-control. In the 1970s, psychologist Walter Mischel conducted a famous experiment with 4-year-old children. He placed a single marshmallow in front of a child and offered a deal. The child could eat it immediately, or if they waited for the researcher to return, they could have 2. Watching these children struggle vividly illustrates the conflict. The elephant, driven by the automatic system, sees the treat and wants it instantly. The rider, grasping the concept of a delayed but superior reward, tries to hold back. Years later, Mischel followed up with these children and found that the amount of time they could hold out powerfully predicted their future success, from their social competence as teenagers to their scores on college entrance exams. The secret of the successful children was not sheer brute willpower. Willpower is like a muscle that tires quickly when pitted against the endless endurance of automatic desire. Instead, the successful children utilized strategy. They possessed the emotional intelligence to look away from the marshmallow, cover their eyes, or distract themselves with games. They used their rider to redirect the elephant's attention, altering the environmental stimuli rather than engaging in a doomed tug-of-war. Mental intrusions. If the rider is merely an advisor, what happens when the elephant refuses to listen? The writer Edgar Allan Poe captured this beautifully in his story, The Imp of the Perverse, in which a murderer, having gotten away with his crime, accidentally plants the thought of confessing in his own mind. The harder he tries to suppress the thought, the more dominant it becomes, ultimately driving him to a frantic public confession. Social psychologist Dan Wegner brought this imp into the laboratory. When people are instructed not to think of a white bear, they find it nearly impossible. The moment they cease their active suppression, the thought returns with a vengeance. Wegner calls this an ironic process of mental control. When the conscious rider sets a mental goal, such as do not think about X, an automatic, unconscious monitoring system is deployed to ensure the goal is being met. This monitor continually asks, am I thinking about X? By actively searching for the forbidden thought, the monitor continuously introduces it into the mind. Because the controlled system tires rapidly and the automatic system runs tirelessly, the attempt to banish a thought inevitably backfires. This explains why bizarre, inappropriate, or frightening thoughts suddenly pop into our heads when we are trying to be perfectly composed. It is not necessarily the dark, repressed urges of a Freudian unconscious breaking through. It is often merely the automatic system ironically serving up the exact thoughts the conscious system is trying to avoid. The difficulty of winning an argument. The dominance of the elephant is perhaps most clear in the realm of moral judgment. Imagine a scenario where a brother and sister, fully consenting adults using reliable birth control, decide to sleep together once. No one is harmed, and they feel closer afterward. When asked if this action is acceptable, almost everyone immediately feels a strong sense of disgust and declares it wrong. But when asked to justify this judgment, people struggle. They argue about the risks of genetic abnormalities, but when reminded of the birth control, they do not change their minds. They search frantically for another reason, claiming psychological harm, and when reminded that the story explicitly states it strengthened their bond, they are left dumbfounded. They know it is wrong, but they cannot articulate why. This is because moral judgment is largely aesthetic. Like looking at a painting, the automatic elephant instantly decides whether something is beautiful or repulsive, good or bad. Only after this gut reaction does the conscious rider engage. But the rider does not act as an impartial judge seeking the truth. The rider acts as a lawyer, desperately inventing arguments to defend the elephant's predetermined verdict. When you attempt to win a moral argument by using pure logic to dismantle your opponent's points, you almost always fail. You are merely arguing with the opposing lawyer, while the elephant, the true decision-maker, remains completely unpersuaded. Ultimately, acknowledging the divided self is an exercise in humility. We are not unified masters of our own minds. We are a complex confederation of ancient urges and recent intellect. We are the rider, and we are the elephant. Understanding this dynamic is the crucial first step toward achieving harmony between our passions and our reasoning. Chapter 2. Changing Your Mind. The notion that the universe is governed by change and that our experience of life is shaped entirely by our perception of it stands as one of the most powerful insights in human history. To control our interpretations is to control our reality. Modern self-help gurus and motivational speakers constantly repackage this ancient truth, echoing the Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius and the Buddha. They urge us to recognize that pain often stems not directly from an event, but from our internal reaction to that event. It is a liberating realization. If we can somehow alter our reactions, we can free ourselves from years of accumulated resentment and despair. This art of reframing our perspective is quite old. In the 6th century, the Roman statesman Anicius Boethius found himself stripped of his wealth, falsely accused of treason, and imprisoned on a remote island awaiting execution. In his misery, he wrote The Consolation of Philosophy, describing a visitation from the majestic apparition of Lady Philosophy. She scolded him for his unphilosophical despair and proceeded to challenge his assumptions. She reminded him that the goddess of fortune is inherently fickle. She spins her wheel without regard for anyone's expectations. Boethius had enjoyed her favors for a long time, but he had no right to demand that she remain chained to his side. By guiding his imagination up to the heavens, Lady Philosophy helped him see the earth as a tiny speck and his own misfortunes as insignificant. By teaching him to accept that nothing is inherently miserable unless one thinks it so, she helped him break the chains of his mental prison before his physical death. While Boethius's story is a profound testament to the power of cognitive insight, it relies heavily on a dynamic we must question. Lady Philosophy was working entirely with the rider, the conscious, verbal, reasoning self. Yet as anyone who has ever experienced a sudden epiphany knows, the thrill of insight usually fades within a few days or weeks. You cannot simply command the rider to change his outlook and expect the massive, emotional elephant to immediately follow suit. Epiphanies do not automatically alter our deeply ingrained behaviors. To achieve lasting transformation, we must retrain the elephant, a process that requires far more than logical argument. We must first understand why the elephant is so naturally inclined toward anxiety and pessimism. The like-o-meter. To understand the elephant, we must understand its primary language, which consists almost entirely of two words: approach and withdraw. Every animal, from the simplest to the most complex, must constantly make rapid evaluations of its environment. When a monkey bites into a sweet fruit, an internal mechanism immediately registers pleasure, signaling the animal to keep eating. A bitter taste triggers a flash of displeasure, halting the behavior. There is no need for rational deliberation. The responses are immediate and visceral. Humans possess a highly sophisticated version of this mechanism, an internal gauge that is constantly running. Though its operation is subtle, careful psychological experiments demonstrate that we generate an instantaneous reaction of like or dislike to almost everything we encounter, even before we are consciously aware of the stimulus. In studies of affective priming, participants are asked to categorize words as good or bad. When a word like fear is flashed subliminally, too quickly for the conscious mind to register, the internal gauge instantly swings toward the negative. A split second later, if the participant is shown a negative word like boredom, they identify it as bad much faster because their internal gauge is already primed for negativity. Conversely, the subliminal flash of a negative word slows down their ability to recognize a positive word. This automatic evaluation system allows researchers to bypass the conscious rider and speak directly to the elephant, revealing deeply ingrained biases that the conscious mind might deny. But the influence of this gauge extends far beyond laboratory experiments. It shapes the trajectory of our lives in astonishing ways. Research into implicit egotism reveals that our internal gauge is strongly triggered by the sound of our own names. When we encounter words or names that share our initials or phonetic structure, we experience a subtle, unconscious flash of pleasure. As a result, people named Dennis or Denise are disproportionately likely to become dentists. Men named Lawrence frequently become lawyers. People named George tend to move to Georgia. This trivial phonetic resonance can subtly influence the most significant decisions we make, our careers, our geographic locations, and even our spouses. The elephant reacts instinctively to these hidden currents of pleasure, subtly steering the rider toward unexpected destinations. Negativity bias. If you spend time in the waiting room of any clinical psychologist, you will find it filled predominantly with people seeking to loosen up, to conquer their persistent anxieties, and to silence their internal critics. For the vast majority of humanity, the elephant perceives an overwhelming number of threats and an insufficient number of opportunities. From an evolutionary standpoint, this pessimistic bias is perfectly logical. Consider the survival requirements of any animal. The cost of missing a potential opportunity, a missed meal or a missed mate, is relatively low. There will always be other chances. However, the cost of missing a threat, failing to notice a predator, is absolute and final. Natural selection favors organisms that prioritize danger over delight. Therefore, a fundamental design principle of the animal mind is that bad is stronger than good. This negativity bias permeates human psychology. In romantic relationships, it takes multiple positive interactions to undo the emotional damage of a single harsh criticism. In financial decisions, the pain of losing $100 vastly outweighs the pleasure of gaining the same amount. Our minds are rigidly wired to notice and react to violations, setbacks, and dangers much more intensely than to equivalent blessings. Our behavior is governed by two opposing motivational systems: the approach system, which pulls us toward positive stimuli, and the withdrawal system, which jerks us away from negative ones. Both systems are constantly active, maintaining a delicate balance. However, the withdrawal system can rapidly escalate to maximum power, instantly overriding the slower approach system. This is because the brain has developed a neurological shortcut. While complex sensory information is routed through the thalamus to the cerebral cortex for slow, conscious processing, a parallel signal is sent directly to the amygdala, a primitive structure situated deep within the brain. The amygdala acts as an early warning system. If it detects a pattern associated with past danger, like the sudden hiss of a snake, it triggers a full-blown fight-or-flight response fractions of a second before the conscious mind even recognizes what the object is. Crucially, the amygdala does not merely activate the body, it reaches up into the frontal cortex and alters our thinking. It shifts the entire brain into a withdrawal orientation. A sudden flash of fear raises a mental filter, causing the conscious mind to interpret all ambiguous events as potential threats. When Shakespeare's Hamlet observed that his thinking made his world a prison, he was experiencing this very phenomenon. His profound negative emotions had hijacked his cognitive processes, ensuring that his thinking would render everything bleak and unprofitable. The cortical lottery. Hamlet's profound despair was undoubtedly triggered by his tragic circumstances, but his enduring melancholy suggests he was also burdened with a pessimistic nature. When we examine the foundations of human personality, we find that nature exerts a much stronger influence than we often wish to admit. Consider the extraordinary cases of identical twins separated at birth and raised in completely different environments. When reunited decades later, these twins often display terrifyingly similar quirks, habits, and phobias. They might both drink their coffee cold, fear the exact same things, or unconsciously utilize the exact same hand gestures. Identical twins, who share all of their genes, are remarkably similar on nearly every measurable personality trait, regardless of how they were raised. Fraternal twins, who share only half their genes, are profoundly different. Genes do not act as rigid blueprints, but rather as complex recipes that construct our neurobiology over time. Because identical twins are built from the same recipe, their brains process the world in remarkably similar ways. Some twins are simply born lucky. They possess sunny dispositions and an innate capacity to see the good in the world. Others are born with a propensity for gloom. Happiness is one of the most highly heritable aspects of our personality. Twin studies consistently demonstrate that 50 to 80% of the variance in our baseline levels of happiness is determined by our genetic code. This baseline is known as a person's affective style, which reflects the typical balance of power between their approach and withdrawal systems. This balance can actually be observed in the electrical activity of the brain. Individuals who naturally experience higher levels of activity in the left frontal cortex report feeling more daily happiness and less fear and anxiety. They recover from setbacks more quickly. Conversely, those who exhibit more activity in the right frontal cortex are more prone to anxiety, fear, and depression. This biological asymmetry is evident even in infants. Babies with right-dominant brain activity are more likely to cry when separated from their mothers, and they often grow into anxious toddlers, fearful teenagers, and adults who struggle constantly to manage their hyperactive withdrawal systems. They lost the cortical lottery, and their minds possess a natural tendency to construct a reality filled with shadows. How to change your mind? Recognizing the genetic and biological foundations of our pessimism might seem discouraging. If our affective style is hardwired, simply resolving to be happier or to change our outlook through sheer willpower is an exercise in futility. It is like trying to change your height by wishing it so. However, while we cannot alter our genetic recipe, we can actively intervene in the functioning of our minds. We can use indirect, psychologically sophisticated methods to retrain the elephant and expand our repertoire of available thoughts. There are 3 highly effective tools for fundamentally altering our affective style. The first tool is meditation. For thousands of years, Eastern traditions have understood that the mind is in a constant state of frantic activity, continuously generating desires, attachments, and fears. Buddha recognized that these attachments act as a rigged game of roulette. The more you play, the more you suffer when circumstances inevitably change. Meditation is the systematic practice of focusing attention and quieting the incessant chatter of the conscious mind. It is not about analyzing problems, but about breaking the cycle of automatic reactions. By sitting still and training the mind to focus on a single point, such as the breath, the rider gradually learns to tame the elephant. Over months of consistent practice, the frequency of fearful, grasping, and negative thoughts significantly decreases. Meditation fundamentally alters the brain's baseline, bringing a profound sense of calm and reducing the sting of life's inevitable losses. The second tool is cognitive therapy, a distinctly Western approach developed in the 1960s by Aaron Beck. Breaking with the Freudian tradition of digging up childhood traumas, Beck focused entirely on the present, specifically on the distorted thought patterns that characterize depression and anxiety. He observed that depressed individuals are trapped in a cognitive triad of negative beliefs. They believe they are worthless, their world is bleak, and their future is hopeless. When a minor setback occurs, their automatic system instantly generates catastrophic, self-flagellating thoughts. Cognitive therapy trains the rider to catch the elephant in the act. Patients are taught to identify these automatic thoughts, write them down, label the specific logical distortions like overgeneralization or magnification, and consciously formulate more accurate, realistic alternatives. It is a process of gradual behavioral shaping. Each time the rider successfully reframes a negative thought, the resulting reduction in anxiety serves as a tiny reward, slowly teaching the elephant a new way to respond to the world. When practiced diligently, cognitive therapy is as effective as medication, and its benefits endure because the fundamental mechanisms of the mind have been retrained. The third tool is the use of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, such as Prozac. While meditation and cognitive therapy require significant time and effort, these medications offer a chemical intervention that can rapidly alter a person's affective style. By increasing the availability of serotonin in the brain's synapses and perhaps by stimulating the growth of vital cells in the hippocampus that are often damaged by chronic stress, these drugs can profoundly reduce the dominance of the withdrawal system. For individuals who have spent their lives struggling against an overactive anxiety response due to a poor draw in the cortical lottery, the effect can be miraculous. The world literally changes color as the heavy filter of pessimism is lifted. While some argue that relying on medication is a dangerous shortcut that sacrifices authenticity, this view ignores the profound suffering of those burdened with severe negativity bias. If a person's natural biology prevents them from experiencing joy and leaves them paralyzed by fear, utilizing a chemical tool to achieve a healthier balance is not a betrayal of the self, but a valid method of removing an obstacle to flourishing. Ultimately, the ancient assertion that our lives are the creation of our minds is true, but it is incomplete without an understanding of the mechanics behind that creation. Because our minds are divided, and because our automatic systems are heavily biased toward the negative, changing our perception requires more than just a momentary philosophical realization. It requires dedicated practice, whether through the stillness of meditation, the rigorous mental hygiene of cognitive therapy, or the biological assistance of psychopharmacology to tame the elephant and genuinely reshape the world we experience. Chapter 3. Reciprocity with a Vengeance. Across the vast landscape of human philosophy and religion, one moral imperative appears with such startling frequency that it demands our attention. It is found in the teachings of Confucius, who was asked for a single word to guide one's life and replied, reciprocity. It was articulated by Rabbi Hillel, who summarized the entire Torah while standing on one foot by saying, "What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor." And it was enshrined by Jesus of Nazareth as the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This near-universal convergence is not a mere coincidence. It is an acknowledgement of the fundamental law of human social life. Reciprocity is the invisible currency that facilitates all human interaction, the mechanism that allowed us to step out of the isolated wilderness and construct the complex architectures of civilization. Ultra-sociality. To truly appreciate the miracle of human cooperation, we must first look at the unforgiving logic of the natural world. Evolution by natural selection is an inherently competitive process. It is a merciless contest where organisms prioritize their own survival and the propagation of their own genes. Against this backdrop, the concept of ultra-sociality, the ability to live in vast cooperative societies of thousands or millions of individuals with a complex division of labor, appears almost impossible. In the entire history of life on Earth, ultra-sociality has evolved independently only a handful of times. It is found among the Hymenoptera, ants, bees, and wasps, the termites, the naked mole rats, and human beings. The insects and the mole rats achieved this extraordinary cooperation through a specific genetic quirk. They are essentially all siblings. Because they share almost all of their genes, their evolutionary interests are perfectly aligned. The hive operates as a single, massive organism where the individual worker is no more than a disposable cell. Humans, however, are the great anomaly of the animal kingdom. We do not operate as genetic clones. We routinely form massive cooperative networks with complete strangers with whom we share no close blood ties. We build sprawling cities, multinational corporations, and interconnected global markets, successfully overriding the deeply ingrained, selfish imperatives of our evolutionary past. How did a primate species possessing no genetic mandate for hive-mindedness manage to conquer the globe through profound cooperation? The answer lies in the psychological machinery of reciprocity. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. For reciprocal altruism to emerge in a species without shared genetics, a very specific set of conditions must be met. Individuals must possess the cognitive capacity to recognize one another, to remember past interactions, and to live long enough to reap the delayed benefits of cooperation. The classic non-human example is the vampire bat. These bats must feed on blood frequently to survive. On any given night, some bats will be successful while others will starve. To stave off death, a successful bat will regurgitate a portion of its meal to feed an unsuccessful neighbor. This is not pure selfless charity. It is a calculated evolutionary gamble. The bat shares with the implicit understanding that on a future night, when its own hunt fails, the neighbor will return the life-saving favor. In the 1970s, evolutionary biologist Robert Trivers mapped the mathematical logic of this behavior, demonstrating how reciprocal altruism could flourish among selfish individuals. If two individuals cooperate, they both enjoy a net benefit. However, the system is highly vulnerable to free riders, individuals who gladly accept the help of others but refuse to pay the cost of reciprocating. If free riders proliferate, the cooperators are driven to extinction and the entire social structure collapses. To solve the problem of the free rider, human beings evolved a sophisticated suite of moral emotions designed to manage our social ledgers. We do not calculate the mathematics of game theory with our conscious minds. Rather, the elephant does the work through visceral feelings. When someone does us a favor, we do not merely acknowledge it, we experience the emotion of gratitude which compels us to return the kindness. When we contemplate cheating a neighbor, we experience the anticipatory dread of guilt, a heavy psychological brake on selfish behavior. When we see someone in distress, we feel sympathy, which prompts us to offer aid, implicitly recognizing that such actions build vital social capital. These moral emotions are the psychological glue that binds us into cooperative webs, allowing mutual benefit to triumph over immediate self-interest. You stab his back, I'll stab yours. However, a system built solely on gratitude and sympathy is inherently unstable. If we only possessed positive emotions, the free riders would mercilessly exploit the generous until there was nothing left to take. For reciprocity to function as the bedrock of ultra-sociality, it must possess a dark, unforgiving side. It demands vengeance. Vengeance is frequently condemned by modern society as a primitive pathology, a destructive urge that we must strive to overcome. Yet, from an evolutionary perspective, vengeance is entirely rational and absolutely necessary. When someone violates the unspoken contract of reciprocity, when they take without giving or intentionally inflict harm, we feel a burning sense of anger and a profound urge to retaliate. We are often willing to endure significant personal costs to ensure that the cheater is punished. This punitive instinct serves as a vital deterrent. It alters the calculus for potential free riders, making the cost of cheating far higher than the potential reward. This mechanism of retaliation is vastly amplified by the human capacity for language, specifically through the profound power of gossip. Gossip often carries a negative, petty connotation, but evolutionary psychologist Robin Dunbar has argued that gossip is the fundamental pillar of human social order. Among primates, alliances are maintained through time-consuming physical grooming. Humans replaced physical grooming with verbal grooming. Gossip allows us to track the reputations of individuals across a vast social network without having to interact with them directly. Through gossip, we establish who is a reliable cooperator and who is a deceitful free rider. It exponentially expands the reach of reciprocity. If you cheat one person in a highly vocal group, you do not just face the vengeance of the victim, you face the collective ostracization of the entire community. The mere threat of a ruined reputation, the terror of becoming an outcast, forces the vast majority of people to meticulously manage their social ledgers and play by the rules of reciprocal altruism. Gossip is the invisible enforcement mechanism that keeps the human hive functioning. Use the force. Luke. Because the instinct for reciprocity is wired so deeply into our emotional elephants, it operates as a profound, almost irresistible force in human affairs. We are intensely uncomfortable when our social ledgers are unbalanced. This discomfort can be, and frequently is, weaponized against us. The social psychologist Robert Cialdini has spent years studying the strategies of compliance professionals, the salespeople, fundraisers, and negotiators who expertly manipulate human psychology for profit. Cialdini demonstrated how these individuals actively exploit the rule of reciprocity to bypass our rational defenses. A classic example is the strategy famously employed by the Hare Krishnas in airports during the 1970s. They discovered that approaching strangers and simply asking for a donation yielded miserable results. The conscious rider easily rejected the request. However, they altered their approach. A Krishna would first press a small gift, a flower or a book, into the target's hand. Even if the target explicitly stated they did not want the flower, the physical receipt of the gift triggered an ancient automatic reflex. The elephant immediately registered an unbalanced ledger. A sense of obligation descended upon the target. When the Krishna subsequently asked for a small donation, the target would eagerly hand over a few dollars, not out of charity, but simply to relieve the intense psychological discomfort of an unreciprocated favor. The conscious rider, caught off guard, would quickly rationalize the transaction just to escape the interaction. This same force is used in negotiations through the tactic of reciprocal concessions. If a negotiator asks for an outrageously large favor and then immediately retreats to a significantly smaller request, the retreat is perceived by our deeply ingrained emotional systems as a concession, a gift. The recipient of this gift suddenly feels a powerful obligation to make a concession of their own, often agreeing to the smaller request, which was the manipulator's true objective all along. Understanding the mechanics of reciprocity is an essential tool for navigating the modern world. It allows us to recognize when our ancient instincts are being exploited by those who seek to profit from our psychological wiring. We can learn to sever the connection between an unsolicited gift and the feeling of obligation. But beyond mere defense, recognizing this force allows us to consciously harness it to cultivate deeper, more meaningful connections. Reciprocity is not inherently cynical. It is the rhythm of human relationship. By initiating small, genuine acts of kindness and freely offering favors without immediate demand for return, we actively weave the invisible, resilient webs of mutual obligation and gratitude that elevate us from isolated individuals into a flourishing community. Chapter 4. The Faults of Others. One of the most universally recognized flaws of human nature is our boundless capacity for hypocrisy. The spiritual traditions of the world are united in their condemnation of it. 2 millennia ago, Jesus of Nazareth delivered one of the most piercing psychological critiques ever recorded when he asked why we so easily spot the tiny speck of sawdust in our neighbor's eye, yet remain completely oblivious to the massive wooden plank obstructing our own vision. The Buddha offered a remarkably similar observation, noting that the faults of others are easily seen, like chaff winnowed in the wind, while one's own faults are hidden, much like a cheating gambler conceals his loaded dice. We are magnificent flaw finders when looking outward, but we are spectacularly blind when looking inward. To understand why we are condemned to this hypocrisy, we must examine the evolutionary pressures that shaped our social minds and the cognitive mechanisms that actively distort our perception of ourselves. Keeping up appearances. In his masterpiece, The Republic, Plato recounts a debate between Socrates and a young man named Glaucon regarding the nature of justice. Glaucon proposes a thought experiment. Imagine a shepherd who discovers a magical gold ring that grants him the power of invisibility. Glaucon argues that any man possessing the ring of Gyges, freed from the fear of being caught and punished, would immediately abandon all morality. He would steal, murder, and satisfy his basest urges, proving that humans are only good because they fear the consequences of a bad reputation. Socrates spends the rest of the dialogue trying to prove Glaucon wrong, arguing that a just man is fundamentally happier than an unjust one, even if the unjust man has all the wealth and power in the world. Modern psychology, however, strongly suggests that Glaucon had the better grasp of human nature. Our evolutionary history as highly social primates who rely on reciprocal altruism created a fierce competition for reputation. In a world where survival depends on alliances, being chosen as a partner is a matter of life and death. Therefore, the most critical evolutionary imperative was not necessarily to be perfectly virtuous, but to appear virtuous to others, while secretly maximizing one's own advantage whenever possible. Psychologist Philip Tetlock has demonstrated that human beings do not process information like objective scientists seeking the absolute truth. Instead, we behave like intuitive politicians. We are constantly anticipating the social environment, assessing who we will have to answer to, and meticulously crafting justifications for our actions before we even take them. Our inner world is essentially a continuous press conference where we are desperately trying to manage our public image. The conscious rider is not steering the elephant toward universal truth. The rider is acting as a relentless public relations agent, tasked with explaining away the elephant's selfish behavior and maintaining a flawless facade. Find your inner lawyer. If the rider is a public relations agent, he is also an extraordinarily skilled defense attorney. Once the automatic system, the elephant, has made a snap judgment or decided on a course of action, the rider immediately goes to work gathering evidence to support that decision. We are plagued by the confirmation bias, an innate tendency to aggressively seek out information that confirms our existing beliefs while completely ignoring or dismissing evidence that contradicts them. The power of this inner lawyer is staggering. When researchers test human reasoning, they find that people are remarkably adept at generating arguments to support their own side of an issue. However, when asked to generate arguments for the opposing side, they suddenly become inept, their minds going blank. Psychologist David Perkins investigated the relationship between intelligence and reasoning by asking people of varying IQ levels to think through social issues. He found that a high IQ did not correlate with a more objective or balanced perspective. Intelligent people did not use their vast cognitive resources to explore both sides of a debate and arrive at a nuanced truth. Instead, they used their superior intellect to act as more expensive, high-powered lawyers. They generated a much larger volume of arguments to defend their initial, intuitive position, completely insulating themselves against counter-arguments. Our reasoning process is fundamentally asymmetrical. When we want to believe something, our inner lawyer asks, "Can I believe it?" We search briefly for a single piece of confirming evidence, and upon finding it, we stop thinking, satisfied that we have permission to hold the belief. But when we are confronted with a proposition we do not want to accept, our lawyer asks a much stricter question. Must I believe it? We subject the unwelcome idea to ferocious scrutiny, searching for any logical loophole, any methodological flaw, or any reason to dismiss it. Because it is almost always possible to find at least one counter-argument, we are able to successfully reject the unwanted truth and maintain our cherished beliefs. The rose-colored mirror. This relentless legal defense team protects our most cherished possession, our own self-esteem. When we look in the mirror, we do not see an objective reflection. We see through a rose-colored filter that subtly enhances every positive attribute and obscures every flaw. This phenomenon is known as the better-than-average effect. In countless surveys, the vast majority of people rate themselves as above average in nearly every desirable trait. Whether it is intelligence, driving ability, leadership skills, or likability, we all believe we reside in the upper percentiles. Mathematically, of course, this is impossible. How do we sustain this collective delusion? We do so by strategically defining the criteria for success in a way that favors our unique strengths. If you ask a man who is incredibly ambitious but emotionally distant what constitutes a good husband, he will emphasize providing financial security and maintaining a stable household. If you ask a man who struggles professionally but is highly affectionate, he will define a good husband primarily in terms of emotional availability and communication. Because we are allowed to set the terms of the evaluation, our inner lawyer effortlessly proves that we are succeeding at the game of life. We are incredibly lenient judges when we stand trial in our own courtrooms. I'm right, you're biased. Our capacity for self-deception reaches its pinnacle when we interact with others who hold opposing views. Because our inner lawyer is so skilled at constructing a coherent, flawless narrative of our own rectitude, we genuinely believe that we perceive reality exactly as it is. Psychologist Lee Ross terms this naive realism, the unshakable conviction that our worldview is the objective truth. When we encounter someone who vehemently disagrees with us, naive realism creates a profound cognitive dissonance. If we are staring directly at the obvious truth, why can't they see it? We typically progress through a predictable series of assumptions. First, we assume they simply lack the correct information, so we attempt to educate them. When they stubbornly refuse to change their minds despite our brilliant explanations, we assume they are either intellectually incapable or intellectually lazy. Finally, when we realize they are intelligent and well-informed, we arrive at the most damaging conclusion. They must be deeply biased by their own self-interest, their ideology, or their inherent malice. Psychologist Emily Pronin has demonstrated that while people are remarkably adept at identifying the cognitive biases that plague others, they possess a massive blind spot regarding their own. We easily spot how a colleague's ambition clouds their judgment, or how a politician's financial ties dictate their voting record. But when we introspect, we find no conscious experience of bias. We look inside our minds and see only rational step-by-step logic. We fail to realize that the bias was injected by the automatic elephant long before the conscious rider even began to deliberate. We are completely convinced of our own objectivity, leaving us baffled and infuriated by the seemingly willful blindness of our opponents. Satan satisfies our hypocrisy as not a heavy, mournful burden. Surprisingly, it is a source of immense psychological pleasure. When our inner lawyer successfully builds a case against an opponent, proving our righteousness and their wickedness, we experience a rush of vindication. Righteous indignation is deeply satisfying. There is an undeniable thrill in discovering the moral failings of others, gossiping about their scandals, and banding together with our allies to condemn them. The moralist is fueled by the intoxicating energy of outrage. By hyper-focusing on the sins of our neighbors, we successfully distract ourselves from the anxiety of our own imperfections. It feels incredibly good to be the victim or the avenging hero in a moral drama. This pleasure binds us into tight-knit, self-congratulatory groups ready to wage war, either literal or rhetorical, against those we have deemed impure. We embrace a Manichaean worldview, dividing the universe neatly into the forces of light, us, and the forces of darkness, them. The myth of pure evil. This deep-seated need to see ourselves as the heroes of our own narratives gives rise to one of the most dangerous and pervasive delusions in human history, the myth of pure evil. When we try to understand why horrific crimes, genocides, or acts of cruelty occur, we naturally recoil. To make sense of the horror, we instinctively resort to the myth of pure evil, which consists of three distinct components. First, we believe that evildoers are driven purely by sadism and the desire to inflict pain for its own sake. Second, we believe that the victims are perfectly innocent and entirely blameless. Third, we believe that the evildoers represent a foreign, alien threat, an intrusion from the outside world that disrupts a peaceful community. Psychologist Roy Baumeister dedicated years to studying the roots of violence and cruelty, analyzing the perspectives of both victims and perpetrators. He discovered a massive magnitude gap between the two viewpoints. From the victim's perspective, the myth of pure evil fits perfectly. The harm seems entirely unjustified, malicious, and devastating. But when Baumeister examined the accounts of the perpetrators, he found something deeply disturbing. Perpetrators almost never see themselves as evil. Instead, the people committing acts of violence usually view themselves as the victims. They construct elaborate narratives of grievance and self-defense. Most violence is not driven by sadistic monsters. It is driven by two far more common psychological profiles. The first is high self-esteem combined with a profound sense of entitlement. When a narcissist feels insulted or disrespected, Their fragile ego demands violent retaliation to restore their inflated self-image. The second and far more lethal driver of violence is moral idealism. The greatest atrocities in human history, the Crusades, the Inquisition, the Holocaust, the purges of Stalin and Mao, were not committed by people who thought they were doing evil. They were committed by people who were absolutely convinced they were doing good, eradicating a perceived impurity to create a utopian society. The myth of pure evil blinds us to the reality that evil is almost always a product of our own self-righteousness, an endless cycle of retaliation where each side is utterly convinced of its own moral superiority. Finding the great way. If our minds are evolutionary machines designed for hypocrisy, self-deception, and righteous indignation, how can we possibly achieve peace, either internally or globally? How do we remove the massive wooden plank from our own eye? The solution requires a radical shift in perspective, one that is exceptionally difficult for the elephant to accept. We must consciously step off the treadmill of moralism. The 8th century Zen master Senkan articulated this beautifully when he wrote, "The great way is not difficult for those who have no preferences. When love and hate are both absent, everything becomes clear and undisguised. If you wish to see the truth, then hold no opinions for or against anything. To set up what you like against what you dislike is the disease of the mind." Senkan is not advocating for complete moral apathy or nihilism. He is pointing toward the necessity of silencing the inner lawyer. As long as we are desperately attached to proving that we are right and others are wrong, our vision will remain hopelessly distorted by the rose-colored mirror and the myth of pure evil. To find the great way, we must actively cultivate the practice of looking for our own faults. We must force ourselves to identify the specific biases and selfish motivations that are driving our own behavior, especially in the midst of a conflict. It is a profoundly painful exercise to admit that we are partly to blame, that our opponents might have a valid point, and that our righteous anger is largely a self-serving performance. But this painful admission is the only mechanism capable of dismantling our hypocrisy. By acknowledging our own profound capacity for self-deception, we deflate the swollen ego, quiet the relentless demands of the inner lawyer, and finally begin to see the world and the people in it with clarity and compassion. Chapter 5. The Pursuit of Happiness. For centuries, humanity has chased a phantom. We operate under a collective illusion that joy is a destination, a fixed coordinate on the map of our lives. We tell ourselves that if we can just acquire the right career, secure the perfect romantic partner, or amass a specific amount of wealth, the gates of fulfillment will open and we will finally be at peace. Yet those who actually reach these highly coveted summits frequently report a jarring and unexpected sensation. Upon finally grasping the prize they spent years agonizing over, the overwhelming emotion is not eternal bliss, but a quiet, hollow relief, quickly followed by the unsettling thought, "Is this all there is?" The profound disappointment of ultimate success is a deeply human experience, and it points to a fundamental misunderstanding of how our emotional machinery operates. To comprehend why our victories often feel so fleeting, we must examine the psychological mechanism of the progress principle. When an animal encounters something beneficial for its survival, its brain releases a surge of dopamine, the neurotransmitter responsible for pleasure and reinforcement. However, the evolutionary design of the mind is highly specific. This dopamine reward is not dispensed as a massive, enduring payout upon final completion of a task. Rather, it is administered in small, steady increments as the animal moves toward its goal. The human mind functions exactly the same way. The emotional elephant is continuously evaluating our environment, doling out satisfaction for every step forward. When we finally reach the ultimate destination, the journey is over. The steady stream of dopamine ceases. The joy we experience resides almost entirely in the striving, in the active friction of moving forward, rather than in the static condition of having arrived. As Shakespeare eloquently observed, things won are done. Joy's soul lies in the doing. Pleasure comes more from making steady progress toward our goals than from actually achieving them. This leads us to a second, equally formidable mechanism of the human mind. The adaptation principle. We are bound to a hedonic treadmill. Whenever our circumstances change, whether for better or for worse, our emotional systems react intensely at first, but very quickly the mind calibrates to the new normal. The most striking evidence of this comes from psychological studies comparing individuals who have won massive lottery jackpots with those who have suffered catastrophic accidents resulting in paralysis. Immediately following the events, the emotional divergence is extreme. Yet within a year, the lottery winners are no longer floating on a cloud of euphoria. and the accident victims are not drowning in perpetual despair. Both groups return remarkably close to their original baseline levels of happiness. We are notoriously terrible at effective forecasting. We vastly overestimate the intensity and duration of the happiness a new car or a new house will bring, and we equally overestimate the endlessness of the misery a setback will cause. The elephant simply habituates to the new environment, resetting the gauge, leaving us running exhaustively on a treadmill just to stay exactly where we are. Faced with the inescapable reality of these two mental mechanisms, the wisest minds of antiquity arrived at an early happiness hypothesis. Looking at the brutal, unpredictable world around them, thinkers like the Stoic philosopher Epictetus and the Buddha realized that investing one's hopes in the external world is a foolish gamble. If all worldly achievements trigger the progress principle only temporarily, and if the adaptation principle invariably erodes the joy of any possession or status, then the external world is nothing but a trap. Their profound conclusion was that attachment inherently leads to suffering. The only logical response is to step off the treadmill entirely. Instead of desperately trying to conquer the uncontrollable environment, one must retreat to the inner citadel. By severing emotional attachments to wealth, reputation, and worldly desires, and by training the mind through rigorous discipline and meditation, a person can achieve a state of unbreakable tranquility. The ancient hypothesis is definitive. True happiness comes entirely from within, through the mastery of the mind and the cessation of desire. But as profound and liberating as this ancient wisdom is, modern science compels us to ask if it is entirely accurate. To answer this, we must look at what positive psychology calls the happiness formula. Researchers who study human well-being propose an equation: H = S plus C plus V. Our enduring level of happiness, H, is determined by our biological set point, S, the conditions of our lives, C, and the voluntary activities we choose to engage in, V. The biological set point, as dictated by the cortical lottery, accounts for a massive portion of our baseline mood. But the ancient philosophers argued that the C, the external conditions of our lives, does not matter because we adapt to everything. Modern research proves this is partially false. There are certain external conditions to which we never fully adapt. For instance, chronic, unpredictable noise profoundly damages our well-being. A long, heavily trafficked commute through unpredictable congestion is a daily source of psychological misery that never loses its sting. A persistent lack of control in our daily environments, or a lack of deep, supportive interpersonal relationships, will permanently depress our baseline. Therefore, some external conditions matter intensely, and changing them is a mathematically sound strategy for increasing our baseline happiness. Beyond altering our conditions, the true art of living well relies on the V of the equation, the voluntary activities we pursue. This pursuit reaches its highest form in finding flow. The psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi discovered that people experience the deepest satisfaction not when they are passively relaxing, but when they are fully immersed in a challenging task that perfectly matches their skill level. This state of flow is a moment of total absorption where the ego disappears, time warps, and the conscious rider and the emotional elephant move in perfect unison. It is critical to distinguish between simple physical pleasures like eating a rich dessert or resting in a hot bath, and genuine gratifications. Pleasures are sensory and fleeting. The adaptation principle extinguishes them quickly. Gratifications, however, demand active engagement. They challenge us, force us to use our signature strengths, and leave us with a complex sense of accomplishment. Cultivating a life rich in flow is vastly superior to a life spent merely accumulating physical comforts. Yet despite this evidence, the human mind repeatedly traps itself. We are continuously drawn into misguided pursuits. Because our evolutionary elephant is deeply wired to compete for social status and resources, we constantly confuse what looks good to the tribe with what actually feels good to the self. We engage in conspicuous consumption, purchasing massive houses and luxury vehicles not for their inherent utility, but to signal our rank to others. This creates an unwinnable arms race. Status is a zero-sum game. If everyone stands up on their tiptoes, no one sees any better, but everyone's legs ache. We make the tragic error of sacrificing things that possess absolute value, such as our free time, our physical health, and our closest relationships, in order to acquire things that possess only relative value, like wealth and prestige. We accept a miserable 2-hour commute simply to afford a larger house in a wealthier zip code, willingly trading a permanent emotional deficit for an empty status symbol to which we will inevitably adapt. When we hold these contemporary psychological insights up to the light of antiquity, we arrive at the happiness hypothesis reconsidered. The Buddha and the Stoic philosophers were brilliant diagnosticians of the human condition. They perfectly understood the tyranny of the hedonic treadmill and the futility of chasing status. However, their prescription, complete detachment and emotional withdrawal, was somewhat overly defensive. They lived in an era of immense physical insecurity where fortunes and lives could be violently erased in a single afternoon. In such a world, the inner citadel is a logical sanctuary. But in our modern era, equipped with a greater degree of safety and freedom, completely severing all attachments cuts us off from the very elements that make life profoundly worth living. We do not adapt to good relationships. They are a constant, renewing source of vital energy. We do not adapt to the profound engagement of flow. The ancient hypothesis is only half true. True fulfillment is not achieved solely through inward retreat. We must strike a delicate, deliberate balance. Happiness requires the ancient wisdom of managing our internal interpretations, but it equally requires the modern courage to forge vital, meaningful connections with the external world. Happiness comes from within, but it also unequivocally comes from without. Chapter 6. Love and Attachments. In 1931, a 4-year-old boy contracted polio and was immediately placed into an isolation ward in a Brooklyn hospital. At that time, before the advent of a vaccine, the disease provoked widespread terror. The boy spent weeks deprived of human contact, attended only by a masked nurse. His mother visited daily, but she was restricted to waving and trying to speak through a pane of glass on the door. The boy begged her to enter, a plea that must have been agonizing for her to resist. Eventually, unable to bear the separation, she broke the rules and went inside, earning a severe reprimand from the hospital staff. The boy eventually recovered without paralysis, but the haunting image of a solitary child staring at his mother through a barrier perfectly encapsulates a tragic era in our understanding of human needs. That boy was born into a period dominated by 3 prevailing scientific ideas. The first was germ theory, which had initiated a fierce crusade against pathogens. In the early 20th century, medical professionals recognized the catastrophic mortality rates in orphanages and foundling homes, concluding that isolation in sterile cubicles was the only way to save young lives. Mothers and nurses were told to keep their distance, prioritizing hygiene over affection. The other 2 dominant ideologies were psychoanalysis and behaviorism. Despite their vast differences, both paradigms agreed that an infant's bond to its mother was fundamentally built on the provision of milk. Psychoanalysts believed that the infant's earliest desire for pleasure was satisfied by the breast, eventually transferring to the mother herself. Behaviorists viewed the breast merely as a biological reinforcement, a reward for the behavior of suckling. Cuddling, holding, and expressing unconditional affection were widely condemned by experts of the era as practices that would inevitably produce spoiled, overly dependent children. Love was treated as a dangerous indulgence, subordinate to nutrition and discipline. The journey to correct this profound scientific misunderstanding, to prove that infants require love as urgently as they require sustenance, began with 2 rebellious psychologists who dismantled the dogmas of their respective fields. The first of these pioneers, Harry Harlow, began his career studying the feeding behaviors of rats before moving to the University of Wisconsin. Lacking a proper laboratory, he took his students to a local zoo, where they observed primates displaying an innate, persistent curiosity. The monkeys enthusiastically solved mechanical puzzles for the sheer satisfaction of understanding them, directly contradicting the behaviorist assertion that animals act only to receive external rewards. Seeking to study this intelligence formally, Harlow constructed his own primate laboratory. As his facility expanded, he separated infant macaques from their mothers to prevent the spread of disease, inadvertently creating an orphanage for monkeys. He noticed that these infants became desperately attached to the cloth pads placed in their cages, throwing tantrums if the rags were removed. This observation sparked a revolutionary question. Could it be that the monkeys harbored an innate biological need to hold and be held, a need that behaviorist baby farms were violently starving? To test this, Harlow designed a brilliant and now legendary experiment. He constructed 2 surrogate mothers for baby monkeys. One was a cylinder made of bare wire mesh. The other was covered in soft foam and terry cloth. Some monkeys received their milk from a tube protruding from the wire mother, while others were fed by the cloth mother. If the psychoanalysts and behaviorists were correct, the monkeys would attach themselves strictly to the source of their nourishment. Instead, all the infants spent nearly all their waking hours clinging desperately to the soft cloth mother. Even those forced to feed from the wire mother would stretch their bodies across the divide, keeping their hind legs firmly planted in the comforting folds of the terry cloth. Harlow had proven the existence of contact comfort, demonstrating that young mammals possess a profound, independent need for physical affection. When denied a real mother, they will seek out whatever provides the closest tactile approximation. Across the Atlantic, a British psychiatrist named John Bowlby was arriving at a similar conclusion through an entirely different avenue. Raised in an aristocratic environment where nannies handled child-rearing, Bowlby became a psychoanalyst and subsequently worked with troubled, affectionless children. Following the devastation of World War II, which had created unprecedented numbers of orphans and displaced children across Europe, the World Health Organization asked Bowlby to study the effects of these massive parental separations. His 1951 report was a fierce indictment of the prevailing medical belief that biological needs superseded emotional ones. Bowlby argued passionately that children absolutely require maternal love to develop normally. Facing intense skepticism from orthodox psychoanalysts, Bowlby found an unexpected intellectual ally in evolutionary biology. He learned of ethological research demonstrating how newly hatched ducklings instantly imprint on a mother figure and follow her relentlessly. He realized that the bond between a mother and child does not need to be explained away as a secondary byproduct of feeding or libido. It is an ancient, hardwired, evolutionary survival mechanism. When Bowlby eventually connected with Harlow, the two formed a formidable alliance, merging grand theory with irrefutable experimental evidence. Bowlby formulated attachment theory, conceptualizing the parent-child relationship as a cybernetic system similar to a thermostat. A child is driven by two competing evolutionary imperatives: the need for safety, which ensures immediate survival, and the need for exploration, which builds the intelligence and skills required for adulthood. When the child feels secure, the exploration drive takes over, allowing for play and learning. But the moment the environment becomes threatening or the mother disappears, the safety drive forcefully engages, causing the child to abandon play and seek proximity to the caregiver. The mother acts as a secure base. Once the child touches home base and is reassured, the internal alarm shuts off and exploration can resume. To raise independent, confident children, one must not starve them of affection. One must provide them with a dependable, secure base from which they can confidently venture into the world. Perfect love does indeed cast out fear. To empirically validate Bowlby's theory and silence the remaining skeptics, a Canadian researcher named Mary Ainsworth provided the crucial methodology. Having observed mothers and infants in Ugandan villages, Ainsworth noted that even in communal societies, children use their specific biological mother as a unique, secure base. Relocating to the United States, she developed the Strange Situation, an experimental drama designed to observe how infants manage their attachment and exploration needs under increasing stress. A mother and child are placed in an unfamiliar playroom with novel toys. Over a series of predetermined intervals, a stranger enters, the mother leaves, the mother returns, and the child is eventually left entirely alone. Ainsworth discovered 3 distinct patterns of managing this stress. The majority of children display a secure attachment. They explore when the mother is present, become distressed when she departs, and seek immediate comfort upon her return before quickly settling back into play. A second group exhibits an avoidant attachment. They seemingly ignore the mother's departure and return, suppressing their distress and attempting to manage their anxiety independently without seeking comfort. A third, smaller group displays a resistant attachment. They are clingy and anxious from the start, become inconsolably devastated when the mother leaves, and paradoxically resist her comforting embraces when she returns, never settling down to play. These attachment styles are not simply the result of good or bad parenting, nor are they purely dictated by genetics. They emerge dynamically from thousands of subtle interactions. A child's innate temperament interacts with a mother's responsiveness over time, gradually building an internal working model in the child's mind regarding what can be expected from relationships. Predictable, comforting interactions build a secure model, fostering lifelong trust and boldness. While these discoveries revolutionized child psychology, their implications stretch far into adulthood, fundamentally explaining the architecture of romantic love. When adults are surveyed using descriptions that perfectly match Ainsworth's 3 childhood attachment styles, the vast majority neatly categorize themselves into secure, avoidant, or resistant patterns regarding their romantic partners. The internal working models constructed in infancy do not vanish. They become the blueprints for our most intimate adult connections. Bowlby identified 4 defining features of an attachment relationship: the desire for proximity, distress upon separation, turning to the figure as a safe haven, and utilizing the figure as a secure base. In childhood, parents serve all 4 functions. As we transition through adolescence, peers begin to fulfill the roles of safe haven and proximity, but it is only in late adolescence and adulthood that a romantic partner fully assumes all 4 responsibilities. The profound similarities between romantic love and the parent-infant bond are not coincidental. They are governed by the same biological machinery. Lovers in the throes of infatuation engage in intense mutual gazing, cuddling, and baby talk, behaviors that trigger the release of oxytocin, the exact same hormone that cements the bond between a nursing mother and her baby. Oxytocin floods the brain during skin-to-skin contact, soothing the nervous system and forging a deep, addictive connection. In adults, the most potent trigger for this neurochemical bonding is sexual intimacy. Romantic love is not an arbitrary cultural invention. It is the ancient mother-child attachment system seamlessly integrated with the adult caregiving and mating systems. Understanding this integration requires looking back at our evolutionary history. In most mammals, the mating system operates independently. A female goes into heat, males compete for sexual access, copulation occurs, and the male departs, leaving the female to activate her caregiving and attachment systems upon giving birth. However, human evolution required a radical departure from this sequence. As our ancestors' brains expanded rapidly over millions of years, they encountered a structural bottleneck. The female pelvis could not accommodate the birth of a fully developed, large-brained infant. The evolutionary solution was to give birth to highly premature, completely helpless babies whose brains would do much of their growing outside the womb. This necessitated years of intensive, uninterrupted care, a burden far too immense for a mother to shoulder alone while simultaneously foraging for survival. For these big-brained offspring to survive, the father had to stay and contribute. To ensure paternal investment, natural selection cleverly wired the ancient attachment and caregiving systems directly into the adult mating system. The biological quirks of human reproduction essentially forced the evolution of romantic love, forging an enduring emotional bond between men and women to secure the survival of their demanding children. Yet, this biological reality frequently clashes with the modern cultural myth of true love. This pervasive myth insists that real love is a fiery, passionate state that never fades, and that the cessation of this intense passion signifies the death of the relationship. This is a profound misunderstanding of how the mind works. Psychologists distinguish clearly between 2 forms of love. Passionate love is a wild, intensely emotional state characterized by euphoria, anxiety, and an overwhelming desire for physical and emotional union. Companionate love, on the other hand, is the deep, steady affection we feel for those whose lives are permanently intertwined with ours. Passionate love operates biologically like a powerful narcotic. It triggers the brain's dopamine reward networks in a manner identical to cocaine or heroin. Consequently, like any drug, the brain eventually develops a tolerance. The frantic, obsessional high of new love is biologically unsustainable. It must eventually wear off to allow the nervous system to regain its equilibrium. This inevitable fading is the critical juncture where the myth of true love causes catastrophic mistakes. When the intoxicating drug of passion weakens, a lover might suddenly notice the flaws of their partner and assume that because the magic has disappeared, the love was a lie. If they abandon the relationship at this stage in search of a new high, they sacrifice the opportunity for companionate love to flourish. Companionate love does not spontaneously replace passionate love. The 2 operate on completely different timelines. While passion spikes dramatically and then plummets, companionate love grows slowly, steadily binding 2 lives together like intertwining vines over decades. True love is not eternal passion. It is robust, companionate love infused with occasional sparks of passion, sustained by a profound, unwavering commitment. Despite its centrality to human flourishing, philosophy has historically harbored a deep hostility toward passionate love. In Eastern traditions, love is often viewed suspiciously because it is the ultimate attachment. To achieve spiritual enlightenment and escape the cycle of suffering, one must sever the emotional chains that bind the mind to the unpredictable physical world, particularly the sensual attachments to a romantic partner. Western philosophy has been equally wary, though for different reasons. From Plato to the Stoics and Epicureans, the intense, particular devotion to a single individual has been pathologized as a disease or an irrational madness that overrides reason and Stoic self-control. Western thinkers often sought to dignify love by stripping it of its fleshly, specific nature. Plato argued that the love of a beautiful body must be transcended, converting into a generalized love for beauty itself, and ultimately a love for philosophical truth. Christian theology similarly elevated agape, a selfless, spiritual love directed toward God and all humanity, while subordinating the passionate love between individuals. This profound discomfort with romantic attachment likely stems from two sources. First, passionate love inherently threatens the social order. It causes people to defy conventions, ignore morality, and behave irrationally. Second, and perhaps more fundamentally, intense love forces a confrontation with our own mortality. By tethering our ultimate happiness to the fragile, mortal body of another human being, we make ourselves agonizingly vulnerable to loss and death. Philosophers have often tried to shield us from this terror by urging us to attach our hearts only to the eternal, the abstract, or the divine. But while the sages sought to protect us by advocating detachment, modern sociology and psychology suggest that a life completely free of constraints and attachments is profoundly hazardous. When the sociologist Emil Durkheim studied suicide rates across Europe, he discovered a startling pattern. Suicide was highest among those who possessed the fewest social bonds and obligations. Individuals unmoored from family, religious communities, and deep interpersonal ties were far more likely to take their own lives. We require constraints, obligations, and the weight of other people to give our lives structure and meaning. An ideology that champions absolute personal freedom and encourages people to constantly sever ties in search of isolated fulfillment contradicts our deepest biological nature. We are an inherently ultra-social species. While navigating the intense vulnerabilities of intimate attachments can indeed invite suffering, those very attachments are the foundational prerequisite for human happiness. To live entirely for oneself is to wither. We must intertwine our roots with others if we are ever to truly bloom. Chapter 7. The Uses of Adversity. Across the vast tapestry of global philosophies, there exists a profound intuition that hardship acts as a crucible for human greatness. The ancient Chinese philosopher Meng Tzu observed that when heaven prepares to bestow a great destiny upon a person, it first breaks their bones with labor, starves their body, and frustrates their every endeavor, all to fortify their spirit and remedy their weaknesses. Millennia later, Friedrich Nietzsche echoed this sentiment with his famous declaration that whatever does not kill us makes us stronger. These ideas tap into a widespread cultural belief in predestination or fate, the notion that our life's script is written before we take our first breath. Imagine for a moment that upon the birth of your child, a divine entity granted you the ability to read this script, along with a pencil to edit the narrative. You scan the timeline and see a heartbreaking chronology: a childhood friend lost to illness at age 9, a devastating physical injury at 20, a bitter divorce at 33. As a loving parent, the overwhelming instinct would be to take the pencil and erase every moment of suffering, smoothing the path to ensure a life of unbroken comfort and joy. Yet, pausing to reflect on Nietzsche's maxim, you might hesitate. If we eradicate all struggle, do we also erase the very friction required to build a resilient, fully developed human being? This dilemma introduces the adversity hypothesis, the premise that encountering and overcoming severe setbacks is not just an unfortunate byproduct of existence, but an essential ingredient for achieving our highest potential and deepest fulfillment. However, we must approach this hypothesis with caution. We know that extreme trauma does not always forge strength, it can shatter the mind. Individuals exposed to the horrors of war, violence, or profound loss frequently suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, leaving them perpetually anxious, hypersensitive to threat, and neurologically scarred. Decades of medical research unequivocally demonstrate that chronic stress corrodes both the body and the brain. Therefore, adopting a blanket belief that all suffering is beneficial is dangerously naive. we must turn to the nuances of psychological science to understand the specific conditions under which the crucible of adversity genuinely refines the human spirit, rather than consuming it. Post-traumatic growth. Consider the story of a man whose life was abruptly dismantled. On what appeared to be an ordinary spring day, he discovered that his wife had vanished, taking their 2 young children with her. After days of agonizing uncertainty, the devastating truth emerged. She had abandoned their marriage to run across the country with a charming but deceitful stranger she had met by chance. The husband was plunged into a nightmare of grief, confusion, and legal battles, stripped instantly of the family that defined his existence. Like the biblical figure Job, he was left entirely unmoored, crying on the floor of an empty house, incapable of understanding how such an incomprehensible catastrophe could happen to him. Yet, as the years passed, a remarkable transformation occurred. The initial despair eventually gave way to a slow, deliberate rebuilding. He focused intensely on securing the return of his children, successfully navigated the legal system, and eventually found a new career path. More importantly, he discovered that the agonizing ordeal had permanently altered his perspective. He no longer took the presence of his children for granted. The mundane struggles of daily life paled in comparison to the sheer joy of having them safe. He had ascended from the depths of despair to a vantage point of heightened appreciation. For a long time, psychology focused primarily on the damaging effects of trauma and, at best, investigated resilience, the ability of a person to bounce back to their baseline after a shock. But in recent years, researchers have begun to systematically study the phenomenon of post-traumatic growth. By observing survivors of diverse tragedies, from life-threatening illnesses and natural disasters to the devastating loss of loved ones, scientists have identified 3 distinct dimensions of profound personal evolution that frequently follow in the wake of disaster. The first dimension is a radical shift in self-perception, rooted in the revelation of hidden capacities. Before a crisis, our conscious minds often construct fragile narratives about our limitations. We convince ourselves that we could never survive the loss of a spouse, the diagnosis of a terminal illness, or the destruction of our home. Yet, when the unthinkable actually occurs, the body and the deeper mind take over. We operate on instinct, moving through the shock and managing the logistics of survival. As the dust settles and we realize we are still breathing, a profound psychological victory is achieved. We discover that our threshold for endurance is vastly greater than our conscious anxieties permitted us to believe. This hard-won knowledge permanently alters our self-concept, inoculating us against the fear of future challenges because we now possess undeniable proof of our own fortitude. The second dimension of growth occurs within our interpersonal connections. Adversity acts as a ruthless but clarifying filter for relationships. When tragedy strikes, the social landscape shifts dramatically. Some acquaintances, paralyzed by their own discomfort or inability to handle heavy emotions, fade into the background. Conversely, others step forward with unexpected grace and unwavering support. This sorting process not only reveals the true depth of our social bonds, but actively strengthens them. The shared experience of vulnerability strips away the superficial layers of interaction, fostering a profound sense of gratitude and a deeper capacity for love. The petty grievances that once dominated our attention are suddenly exposed as trivial, replaced by a fierce appreciation for the people who anchor us in the storm. The third dimension involves a fundamental realignment of life philosophies and priorities. History provides dramatic examples of this, such as the ancient Indian ruler Ashoka, who, after witnessing the staggering carnage of his own military conquests, experienced a profound moral awakening. He renounced violence, embraced Buddhism, and dedicated his empire to peace and ethical governance. While few undergo such imperial transformations, facing our own mortality or the fragility of our existence routinely triggers a similar recalibration. Survivors of severe illnesses often describe their diagnosis as a jarring wake-up call that snapped them out of a state of mindless accumulation. The relentless pursuit of wealth, status, or career advancement is suddenly recognized as a hollow game. In its place emerges a philosophy centered on the present moment, a desire for authentic engagement with life, and a renewed commitment to the things that possess intrinsic rather than merely relative value. Must we suffer? Recognizing that trauma can yield these 3 forms of growth brings us to a difficult question regarding the adversity hypothesis. There is a weak version of this hypothesis which simply states that suffering can lead to growth, a claim easily supported by the evidence. But there is also a strong version which asserts that enduring severe hardship is an absolute prerequisite for reaching the highest echelons of human maturity, wisdom, and fulfillment. If this strong version is accurate, the implications for modern society are deeply unsettling. It suggests that our relentless cultural drive to maximize safety, minimize risk, and litigate against every emotional distress might be profoundly misguided. By aggressively sheltering ourselves and our children from the sting of failure and the friction of conflict, we may be systematically depriving the human spirit of the very resistance it needs to grow. A completely sanitized life, free from the threat of dishonor or deep loss, might produce a society of emotionally fragile individuals incapable of grasping the profound depths of the human experience. But does the scientific data actually support this strong necessity for suffering? When researchers attempt to measure post-traumatic growth using standard personality tests, the results are often puzzling. A person might report feeling completely transformed by a crisis, yet their scores on assessments of fundamental traits, like extroversion or neuroticism, rarely show dramatic shifts. To understand this discrepancy, we must view human personality not as a single monolith, but as a complex structure operating on three distinct levels. The foundation, the first level, consists of our basic personality traits, the ingrained settings of our emotional elephant, such as our baseline anxiety or our natural inclination toward sociability. These traits are heavily influenced by genetics and remain stubbornly stable throughout adulthood. Trauma rarely alters this foundational blueprint. The second level comprises our characteristic adaptations. This is the domain of the rider and the elephant working in tandem to navigate the specific environments we inhabit. It includes our defense mechanisms, our daily habits, and the overarching goals we pursue. Evolutionary pressures have wired us to chase success, prestige, and dominance within our social hierarchies. We often become trapped on the hedonic treadmill, enthusiastically pursuing career milestones and material wealth, mistaking these zero-sum achievements for the path to lasting happiness. Here, adversity plays a crucial role. A sudden, catastrophic loss forcefully derails us from this treadmill. It shatters the illusion that our current trajectory is the only one that matters. In the disorienting aftermath of trauma, we enter a narrow window of psychological plasticity. The allure of superficial achievements fades, allowing us to pivot our characteristic adaptations toward more meaningful pursuits, deepening family ties, engaging in spiritual exploration, or dedicating ourselves to the service of others. The third and highest level of personality is the life story. This is the evolving narrative that our conscious rider constantly weaves to impose meaning and coherence on our past, present, and future. A compelling narrative requires conflict, tension, and resolution. A story devoid of struggle is inherently shallow. When we encounter a profound crisis, our existing narrative framework collapses. We are forced to reconstruct the story of who we are, and in doing so, we often integrate the trauma into a narrative of redemption. We connect our immediate coping strategies with our long-term existential purpose, achieving a state of vertical coherence. The growth reported by trauma survivors may not register on basic personality tests, but it is profoundly real at the level of the life story. Adversity provides the essential narrative pivot that transforms a sequence of events into a journey of profound meaning. Blessed are the sense makers. If suffering contains the potential for such rich psychological development, why does it leave some individuals elevated and others emotionally crippled? The answer lies in the deeply ingrained human need to perceive the world as just and predictable. We instinctively operate on the assumption of reciprocity, that good behavior is rewarded and bad behavior is punished. When a terrible tragedy befalls a genuinely good person, this fundamental cognitive architecture is short-circuited. We struggle to comprehend the senselessness of it all. The pivotal factor in post-traumatic growth is the ability to bridge this cognitive gap, to extract meaning from the chaos. This task of sense-making is heavily influenced by our innate psychological disposition. Individuals who were fortunate enough to win the cortical lottery, those with an optimistic temperament and a neurological bias toward approach rather than withdrawal, possess a distinct advantage. When confronted with a crisis, their default strategy involves active coping. They assess the situation and take concrete steps to mitigate the damage. If direct action is impossible, they seamlessly transition into cognitive reappraisal, actively searching the wreckage for hidden benefits or lessons. They effortlessly construct a redemption narrative, integrating the hardship into a broader story of resilience. Conversely, those burdened with a pessimistic disposition face a much steeper climb. Their natural inclination is to view the world through a lens of threat and vulnerability. In the face of trauma, they frequently resort to avoidance coping, attempting to numb the pain through denial, withdrawal, or substance abuse. Because they are less likely to actively process the event, the trauma remains unresolved, festering as a contaminant within their life story. They construct a narrative that reinforces the cruelty and unpredictability of the universe, plunging them further into despair. Yet this biological predisposition is not an inescapable life sentence. Pessimists can consciously learn the art of sense-making. Groundbreaking psychological research has demonstrated the profound healing power of expressive writing. When individuals who have endured severe trauma are instructed to sit down for a few consecutive days and write continuously about their deepest emotions and thoughts regarding the event, the results are remarkable. It is not the mere act of venting emotion that heals. Screaming or dancing about the pain offers no lasting benefit. The healing mechanism is the linguistic structuring of the experience. By forcing the chaotic, swirling emotions of the elephant into the logical, linear sentences of the rider, the individual constructs a coherent narrative. They answer the agonizing questions of why it happened and what good might eventually be salvaged from the ruins. This deliberate, guided effort to create a story closes the open psychological wound, allowing the person to reap the benefits of reappraisal and finally move forward. Chapter 8. The Felicity of Virtue. When the elders of any society preach the rewards of virtue to the younger generation, they inevitably run the risk of sounding like merchants peddling miracle cures. The timeless promise that a life of goodness will yield health, wealth, and profound joy often falls upon deaf ears. Youth, driven by an innate desire for autonomy, frequently rebels against the moral strictures of adults. We see this archetypal rebellion in our greatest stories. Huckleberry Finn fleeing his respectable foster mother to travel the Mississippi, the young Buddha abandoning his royal palace for the forest, or Luke Skywalker leaving his desert home. We admire these youthful protagonists not for their blind obedience, but because their perilous journeys forge a deep, authentic character. They acquire virtues through the friction of lived experience, not through passive compliance. In the pantheon of self-forged character, Benjamin Franklin stands as a monumental figure. Having chafed under the heavy hand of his older brother, to whom he was apprenticed, a teenage Franklin broke the law, abandoned his contract, and fled to Philadelphia. There, through relentless ingenuity and diligence, he transformed himself into an internationally revered inventor, diplomat, and statesman. Franklin's secret was his deliberate, almost mechanical cultivation of virtue. However, he did not view virtue through the narrow, puritanical lens of simply avoiding sin. He understood it in the much older Greek sense of arete, which translates closer to excellence. Just as the arete of a knife is its sharpness, the arete of a human being is the realization of their fullest potential. Franklin was a master psychologist. He recognized that simply resolving to be good, a command issued by the conscious rider, was entirely insufficient to tame the habits and lusts of the elephant. Therefore, he devised a rigorous training regimen. He identified 13 specific virtues and created a tracking chart, marking his daily failures with black spots. By focusing intensely on one virtue per week, he gradually trained his automatic responses. Though he never achieved the moral perfection he sought, he credited this systematic pursuit of excellence for the enduring happiness of his long life. This is the heart of the virtue hypothesis. The cultivation of excellence is the direct path to human flourishing. The virtues of the ancients. If we examine the foundational texts of the world's oldest civilizations, a striking consensus emerges regarding how moral education should be conducted. Whether reading the Egyptian teaching of Amenemope, the biblical proverbs, or the writings of Confucius, the ancient approach to morality is deeply practical and heavily reliant on maxims and role models. These texts do not offer complex logical proofs. They offer evocative stories and metaphors designed to elicit flashes of intuitive recognition and admiration. The ancients possessed a profound, tacit understanding of human psychology. They knew that moral instruction must speak directly to the emotional elephant. Aphorisms and heroic tales trigger the moral emotions, inspiring emulation. Furthermore, the ancients emphasized practice. Aristotle noted that a person becomes a builder by building, and a harpist by playing the harp. Similarly, we become courageous only by performing acts of courage. Buddha's Eightfold Path is not a list of beliefs to be memorized, but a set of daily practices. For these classical thinkers, morality was not a matter of possessing the right facts. It was a matter of cultivating a finely tuned set of reflexes and social skills. It was practical wisdom etched into the mind through repetition. How the West was lost. Despite this brilliant beginning, the Western philosophical tradition eventually drifted away from the wisdom of character and habit. The shift began with the Greek reverence for reason and scientific inquiry. Science operates on the principle of parsimony, the desire to explain the universe using the smallest possible number of laws. The ancient catalogues of virtues, with their sprawling, culturally specific lists of excellences, frustrated the systematic philosophical mind. Centuries later, during the European Enlightenment, the quest for a single, mathematically precise moral law reached its zenith. Immanuel Kant proposed the categorical imperative, arguing that an action is moral only if one could logically will that everyone else act the exact same way. Shortly thereafter, Jeremy Bentham introduced utilitarianism, the doctrine that the moral choice is always the one that maximizes the total benefit for the greatest number of people. While these two theories differed vastly in their mechanics, they shared a fatal psychological flaw. They elevated the conscious rider to the status of an absolute monarch and completely ignored the elephant. They reduced morality to an abstract, context-free calculation. Consequently, Western ethics transformed from the study of character, what kind of person should I become, into the study of quandaries, what is the right thing to do in this specific dilemma? Moral education in the 20th century followed suit, abandoning the teaching of specific virtues in favor of training children to reason through complex moral trade-offs. This shift stripped morality of its emotional resonance and narrowed its scope almost exclusively to situations involving altruism and self-sacrifice. It created a paradoxical and unappealing version of the virtue hypothesis, essentially trying to convince people that acting against their own self-interest is somehow in their self-interest. The virtues of positive psychology. The realization that modern psychology and philosophy had lost their way sparked a rebellion in the late 20th century. Philosophers like Alasdair MacIntyre argued passionately that abandoning the traditional language of virtue had left modern individuals ethically unmoored and adrift. Concurrently, the founders of positive psychology recognized that the psychiatric establishment possessed a massive diagnostic manual for every conceivable mental illness, but lacked any vocabulary to describe human excellence. To correct this imbalance, psychologists Christopher Peterson and Martin Seligman undertook a monumental project, the creation of a comprehensive classification of human strengths. By analyzing the philosophical and religious traditions of the world, they identified 6 core virtues that are universally valued: wisdom, courage, humanity, justice, temperance, and transcendence. Beneath these 6 broad headings, they categorized 24 specific character strengths, ranging from curiosity and gratitude to self-control and zest. The profound therapeutic insight of this classification is the realization that true growth comes from developing our existing strengths, not from endlessly agonizing over our weaknesses. Trying to fix a fundamental psychological flaw through sheer willpower is exhausting and rarely successful. However, when we identify the specific strengths we naturally possess and actively deploy them to overcome our challenges, the process becomes inherently rewarding. It generates the psychological state of flow, where the rider and the elephant move in joyful harmony. Virtue, when understood as the deployment of our unique excellences, truly becomes its own reward. Hard question, easy answers. It is relatively easy to see how the exercise of strengths like curiosity or zest can be personally fulfilling. But the ultimate test of the virtue hypothesis demands that we confront the narrow, modern definition of morality. Does it truly benefit a person to act altruistically, to sacrifice their own resources for the sake of others? Throughout history, humanity has relied on 2 primary, yet ultimately unsatisfying answers to this question. The first is the religious assurance of cosmic justice. Whether conceptualized as the Christian promise of heaven, the Hindu law of karma, or the childhood intuition that the universe directly punishes bad behavior, the belief in an ultimate moral accounting is pervasive. However, assigning God the role of a cosmic bookkeeper fails to account for the psychological reality that nearly all conflicts are driven by competing moral visions, where both sides genuinely believe they are righteous. The second easy answer comes from evolutionary biology, which posits that altruism is simply a genetic strategy. We help our relatives to ensure the survival of our shared genes, kin altruism, and we help strangers to build a network of favors that we can call upon later, reciprocal altruism. While these evolutionary mechanisms accurately describe the origins of cooperation, they are deeply unsatisfying as a guide for modern life. We are not merely slaves to our genetic programming, and reducing all charity to hidden selfishness fails to capture the profound transformative experience of genuine human connection. Hard question, hard answers. To find the true felicity of virtue, we must look beyond divine reward and genetic programming and examine the structural architecture of the human personality. Personality is not a single, unified entity. It operates on 3 distinct levels. At the base are our foundational traits, the hardwired settings of our emotional elephant. The second level consists of our characteristic adaptations, the specific goals, values, and defense mechanisms we use to navigate our daily environment. The third and highest level is the life story, the evolving narrative we construct to give our existence meaning and purpose. The true benefit of altruistic virtue, such as dedicated volunteer work or deep civic engagement, is that it aligns these 3 levels into a state of profound vertical coherence. When we step outside of our narrow self-interest and work for the betterment of others, we weave a life narrative that is rich, meaningful, and connected to a larger whole. Studies consistently show that individuals who engage in regular volunteer work, particularly the elderly, experience significantly higher levels of happiness and physical health. By giving back, they craft a deeply satisfying conclusion to their life story, achieving a harmony between their daily actions and their ultimate sense of identity. The hard answer is that altruism does not pay off in immediate transactional currency. It pays off by integrating the fragmented self and providing the indispensable psychological nutrient of meaning. The future of virtue. Recognizing the psychological necessity of virtue forces us to confront a difficult cultural reality. In our modern pursuit of absolute individual freedom, we have lost something vital. The sociologist Emil Durkheim warned of the dangers of anomie, a state of normlessness where individuals are freed from all social constraints, but are consequently left rootless and anxious. In the transition from a society that valued the producer virtues of hard work and self-restraint to a society obsessed with mass consumption and individual personality, the language of character was largely discarded. The educational movements of the late 20th century, in a well-intentioned effort to respect diversity, attempted to teach children to clarify their own values in a vacuum, entirely stripped of cultural or religious tradition. But virtues cannot be grown hydroponically. They require the rich, complex soil of a shared community ethos. If we are to revive the felicity of virtue, we cannot simply rely on government mandates or a return to archaic social rigidities. The future of virtue lies in the deliberate creation of local moral communities. We must forge youth charters, where parents, teachers, and community leaders come together to establish a unified, coherent set of expectations for the next generation. By voluntarily embracing shared standards of excellence and holding each other accountable, we can banish the isolation of anomie. We can reclaim the ancient truth that true freedom and lasting happiness are not found in the absence of constraint, but in the joyful, lifelong cultivation of character. Chapter 9. Divinity. With or without God. Our experience of reality is profoundly shaped by the metaphors we construct. We understand complex abstractions by mapping them onto familiar terrain. Life becomes a journey, arguments turn into battlegrounds, and the divided mind transforms into a rider struggling to guide an elephant. Without these metaphorical frameworks, we would be conceptually blind. To understand the intricacies of human morality, religion, and the search for meaning, no metaphor is more illuminating than the one found in Edwin A. Abbott's 19th century novella Flatland. Abbott describes a two-dimensional universe populated entirely by geometric figures. The protagonist, a square, lives his entire life on a flat plane, completely ignorant of any reality beyond length and width. One day, a sphere from the three-dimensional world of Spaceland visits him. Because the square can only perceive what intersects his plane, the sphere appears merely as a circle that inexplicably grows, shrinks, and vanishes. The sphere attempts to explain the concept of up, a direction that is not north, south, east, or west, but entirely outside the plane of Flatland. The square is utterly baffled. In frustration, the sphere forcibly yanks the square out of his two-dimensional existence and into the third dimension. Gazing down upon his world, seeing the insides of his fellow citizens and the totality of his universe all at once, the square is overwhelmed by terror and awe. He experiences a profound enlightenment, prostrating himself before the sphere. When he is eventually returned to Flatland, he desperately tries to preach the gospel of the third dimension, but his fellow figures dismiss him as a lunatic. In the realm of social perception, human beings are much like the unenlightened square. We navigate our social spaces using two primary, universally recognized dimensions. The first is the horizontal dimension of closeness versus distance. We intuitively understand the difference between an intimate friend and a complete stranger. The second is the vertical dimension of hierarchy. We instinctively track status, recognizing our superiors and our subordinates. Our minds are rigidly wired to process these two axes. Yet when we witness an act of extraordinary moral beauty, or when we are struck by the overwhelming grandeur of nature, we experience a sensation of being lifted. This feeling of elevation has nothing to do with social status or hierarchy. It is a movement along a completely different axis. The human mind possesses a fundamental capacity to perceive a third dimension, the dimension of divinity. Recognizing this dimension does not require a belief in a literal God. It is a psychological reality of human perception. While many secular individuals live comfortably in a two-dimensional flatland, dismissing the third dimension as a superstitious illusion, devoutly religious people perceive this vertical axis of sacredness clearly. They understand that our actions can degrade us to the level of beasts or elevate us toward the divine. Understanding this third dimension is an absolute prerequisite for comprehending the intense cultural and religious conflicts that define our modern world. Are we not animals? The journey to recognizing this third dimension often begins with an emotion that seems entirely unspiritual: disgust. If one studies the moral codes of diverse cultures, a striking pattern emerges. Morality is rarely confined just to issues of justice or how people treat one another. Vast portions of cultural law are dedicated to regulating food, menstruation, sex, and the handling of corpses, issues categorized by anthropologists as matters of purity and pollution. Disgust evolved initially as a biological guardian of the mouth, a fierce emotional reflex designed to prevent omnivorous human beings from ingesting pathogens, toxins, or decaying flesh. Over millennia, however, the triggers for disgust expanded. It evolved from guarding the mouth to guarding the entire body, creating a visceral revulsion toward physical deformities, lesions, and improper sexual contact. Because humans lived in dense, terrestrial groups where parasites spread easily, disgust became an essential survival mechanism, enforcing physical separation from contagion. But the psychological reach of disgust did not stop there. It became the emotional bedrock for a myriad of cultural and religious norms. Disgust is the emotion used to draw a firm boundary between humanity and the rest of the animal kingdom. We are biologically animals, performing all the same excretory and reproductive functions as any other mammal. Yet cultures that wish to elevate human beings, or that view the human body as a sacred temple housing a soul, must aggressively manage and conceal this underlying animality. Biological necessities must be performed in private, and strict taboos are established around bodily fluids and death. Imagine a society where people openly copulate in the streets, never bathe, and eat raw carcasses with their teeth. Witnessing such behavior would trigger profound disgust, a visceral confirmation that these individuals have fallen, that they have been degraded to the level of beasts. Disgust is the vigilant sentry at the gates of the body's temple. When the 17th century Puritan minister Cotton Mather witnessed a dog relieving itself at the exact moment he was doing the same, he was struck by the humiliating parallel. He resolved in his diary that, even as his biological needs dragged him down to the condition of a beast, his spirit would simultaneously soar upward. Disgust is rooted in our earthly biology, but it acts as a ladder, pointing our consciousness toward the heavens. The ethic of divinity is one of three distinct moral frameworks that guide human behavior, as identified by the psychological anthropologist Richard Schwader during his extensive research in Bhubaneswar, an ancient temple city in India. The first framework is the ethic of autonomy, which dominates modern Western thought. It focuses on protecting individuals from harm and maximizing their personal freedom. The second is the ethic of community, which prioritizes the integrity of the group, valuing loyalty, obedience, and social order. The third is the ethic of divinity. Within this framework, morality is not primarily about individual rights or group cohesion. It is about protecting the divine spark that resides within each person. The goal is to live a pure and holy life, avoiding the moral pollution of lust, greed, and spiritual degradation. To deeply understand this ethic, one must look at classical texts like the Laws of Manu, an ancient Hindu guidebook that meticulously details how a priest must navigate daily life to maintain his purity. The text explicitly forbids reciting sacred scriptures while engaged in biological functions or after touching corpses or while wearing garments stained by sexual union. The sacred and the profane must be rigidly segregated. In places like Bhubaneswar, this ethic is mapped directly onto the physical world. The city is a spiritual topography of peaks and valleys. Foreigners and lower castes are barred from the inner sanctums of the highest temples because their lack of ritual purity would contaminate the sacred space. This concept of purity extends down to the human body itself, where the head and right hand are considered elevated and pure, while the feet and left hand are deemed polluted. But this elaborate system of physical purity is ultimately a manifestation of a deeper spiritual truth. As a local religious scholar explained, human beings possess the capacity to act like gods or like demons. Our behavior determines our spiritual trajectory. Purity of the body is a stepping stone to purity of the soul. Recognizing the divinity within compels one to act with perfect character, to avoid cheating, violence, and malice. Actions that align with divinity generate positive karma, elevating the soul along the third dimension. Actions that succumb to base, animalistic desires pull the soul downward. This is not exclusively an Eastern concept. The American philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson articulated the exact same principle, arguing that a noble deed instantly elevates the doer, while a mean action contracts the soul. Sacred intrusions occur even in modern societies that pride themselves on having banished the old gods. Returning from the deeply stratified and spiritually saturated environment of India to the relatively flat, autonomy-driven culture of the United States can induce a kind of cultural whiplash. In a secular society, the vertical dimension is obscured, and behavior is governed almost entirely by the rule that one may do whatever one pleases as long as no one else is harmed. Yet, the echoes of the third dimension persist. A century ago, the ethic of divinity was central to American public discourse. Victorian literature routinely warned young men to guard their personal purity, linking the mastery of sexual urges to the preservation of their highest, most noble nature. Even early science textbooks framed alcohol not merely as a chemical intoxicant, but as a corrosive agent that destroyed the holy and pure aspects of humanity, subjugating the divine intellect to the base animal passions. The historian of religion Mircea Eliade argued that the modern West is a historical anomaly. It is the first culture to successfully strip time and space of their inherent sacredness, creating a world that is almost entirely profane, practical, and efficient. In all other cultures, the boundaries between the sacred and the profane are fiercely protected. Yet Eliade noted that sacredness is an irrepressible psychological reality. Even in the most secular lives, crypto-religious behaviors constantly emerge. We imbue specific locations, a childhood home, the site of a first love, with a unique, untouchable quality. These become the holy sites of our private universes, places where we have experienced a reality that transcends the mundane. The third dimension cannot be eradicated. It simply finds new, personal avenues to express itself. Elevation and agape represent the emotional movement upward along this axis of divinity. If witnessing degraded behavior triggers the downward pulling emotion of disgust, what is the exact opposite? When we witness an act of profound moral beauty, a moment of unexpected compassion, immense generosity, or heroic self-sacrifice, we experience a distinct and powerful emotion. People consistently describe this feeling as a warm, glowing sensation in the chest, sometimes accompanied by tears or a tightening in the throat. It is a profound sense of being uplifted. This emotion, elevation, acts as an antidote to the cynicism and withdrawal caused by disgust. Instead of motivating a desire to pull away and cleanse oneself, elevation creates a powerful urge to connect, to help others, and to become a better person. Elevation temporarily dissolves our selfish, ego-driven boundaries. It opens the heart to a specific kind of love. This is not the passionate, grasping love of romantic attachment, which is directed at a specific individual and causes agony when lost. Rather, elevation fosters agape, a selfless, universal love for all of humanity. Because human beings struggle to comprehend a love without a specific target, we naturally attribute this overwhelming, objectless affection to a divine source. We interpret it as the Holy Spirit moving within us, or as a direct encounter with God. These moments of elevation provide subjectively irrefutable evidence of an internal divinity, reinforcing the belief that certain ways of living are inherently nobler and more aligned with the sacred than others. A WE and transcendence can also be triggered by encounters that have nothing to do with human morality. The sheer vastness and staggering beauty of the natural world possess an unparalleled capacity to move the soul along the third dimension. Immanuel Kant recognized this dual trigger when he observed that the two things that filled his mind with ever-increasing awe were the starry heavens above and the moral law within. Charles Darwin, standing amidst the overwhelming grandeur of a Brazilian rainforest, felt a surge of devotion and wonder that convinced him there was more to humanity than mere biology. The transcendentalists understood that immersing oneself in nature is a method of dissolving the ego. Emerson described becoming a transparent eyeball in the wilderness, a state where mean egotism vanishes, and one feels completely absorbed into the universal current of existence. This phenomenon is driven by the emotion of awe. Awe is triggered when we encounter something so vast, whether physically immense, conceptually grand, or socially powerful, that it shatters our existing mental models. Our ordinary cognitive structures cannot accommodate the experience. We are stopped dead in our tracks, feeling momentarily powerless, insignificant, and completely receptive. This psychological paralysis creates an opening for profound transformation. It is the emotional catalyst present in nearly all accounts of religious conversion. The Bhagavad Gita provides the ultimate archetype of this experience when the warrior Arjuna is granted a cosmic eye to perceive the true, infinite nature of the god Krishna. Overwhelmed by the terrifying, blinding majesty of the universe, Arjuna is stripped of his previous certainties and completely surrenders his will to the divine. The psychologist Abraham Maslow referred to these events as peak experiences, arguing that they are a natural biological capacity of the human mind completely independent of specific religious doctrines. During a peak experience, the relentless striving of the ego ceases, the universe is perceived as a unified, perfect whole, and the individual is flooded with joy and gratitude. Maslow lamented that modern science had abandoned this sense of wonder, trading the profound contemplation of the beautiful and the good for a sterile, emotionless cataloguing of facts. The satanic self is the primary obstacle to achieving these states of transcendence. The evolutionary development of human self-awareness was a double-edged sword. It granted us the ability to plan for the future, exercise self-control, and navigate complex social webs, making ultra-sociality possible. But it also cursed us with a relentless internal monologue. We are trapped in a whirlpool of egocentric anxieties, social comparisons, and reputational fears. This constantly chattering self anchors us firmly to the profane material world, blinding us to the dimension of the sacred. Every major spiritual tradition recognizes the self as the ultimate barrier to enlightenment. Spiritual advancement requires the brutal pruning or even the annihilation of the ego, but the self fiercely resists its own destruction. It recoils at the command to surrender its wealth, its status, or its righteous anger toward enemies. It is endlessly clever at finding loopholes and justifying its own greed. In the context of the ethic of divinity, the oversized, grasping ego is the psychological equivalent of Satan. It is the heavy weight pulling the soul downward. Understanding the self as a spiritual adversary is crucial for comprehending why devout individuals are so committed to establishing social frameworks that suppress carnal desires and enforce moral purity. Flatland and the culture war is the inevitable consequence of different groups perceiving reality through completely different dimensional lenses. The bitter political and cultural divides that characterize modern democracies, often mapped as the conflict between progressive and conservative ideologies, are fundamentally clashes between the ethic of autonomy and the ethic of divinity. To a progressive operating within the ethic of autonomy, the ultimate goal of society is to maximize individual freedom and self-esteem. The ideal is a flat, egalitarian landscape where barriers are removed, allowing everyone to express their authentic selves without oppression. Any attempt to dictate personal morality or restrict bodily autonomy, whether regarding sexuality, reproduction, or self-expression, is viewed as an intolerable violation of human rights. Conversely, to a religious conservative operating within the ethic of divinity, The progressive vision of a completely flat, unrestricted world is a vision of hell. If you believe that human beings house a divine spark, and that the ultimate purpose of life is to align oneself with God's will, then a society dedicated solely to personal gratification and self-expression is deeply degraded. From this perspective, the self is not something to be esteemed, it is something to be overcome. The conservative impulse is to resacralize the public square, to erect boundaries that protect the pure from the profane, and to establish laws that encourage individuals to move upward on the third dimension. This mutual incomprehension fuels the myth of pure evil, where each side views the other not merely as incorrect, but as actively malevolent. However, recognizing the psychological reality of the third dimension offers a path out of this destructive binary. While the ethic of autonomy is an essential protector of human rights, preventing the horrific abuses that heavily structured, purity-obsessed societies have historically inflicted upon minorities and outcasts, a society utterly devoid of the ethic of divinity feels barren and spiritually empty. A complete understanding of human nature must acknowledge that the perception of sacredness and the desire for spiritual elevation are not mere superstitions. They are profound, defining features of the human mind. If we can recognize the validity of the vertical dimension, we may begin to understand the passions of our ideological opponents, finding a more nuanced balance between the freedom of the individual and the sacredness of the human spirit. Chapter 10. Happiness comes from between. What was the question? Humanity has always sought the ultimate answer, the defining truth that unlocks the mystery of existence. We seek a profound revelation that will make sense of our struggles and our aspirations. Often we mark the great transitions in our lives with aphorisms and maxims, seeking to capture the essence of the journey ahead. When young adults graduate and face the open horizon, they routinely reach for metaphors of travel, viewing life as a boundless ocean or a long, uncharted highway. They look forward with a mix of fierce optimism and quiet trepidation, instinctively recognizing that the search for purpose is not a simple riddle with a single answer. It is a complex navigation through the currents of self, society, and the universe. The overarching question, what is the meaning of life, is perhaps too vast, too unanchored. Instead, we must ask about purpose within life. How do we cultivate an existence that feels deeply meaningful? Love and work. To understand human flourishing, it helps to discard the metaphor of the mind as a machine. When a machine breaks, a mechanic can open it, replace a broken part, and restore its function. Humans are not machines. They are more akin to plants. A withered plant cannot be mechanically fixed. Instead, the gardener must provide the essential conditions for growth, sunlight, water, and fertile soil, and then step back, allowing the organism's innate vitality to do the rest. For human beings, the foundational conditions for flourishing are love and work. We are an inherently ultra-social species wired for deep connection. We wither in isolation. We require secure attachments to others to feel grounded and safe. Beyond love, we need to exert our energies purposefully. Work, in its broadest sense, whether it is a profession, raising a family, or mastering a craft, provides the structure for our ambition. When we weave our affections into our daily labor, we draw ourselves out of the confines of the ego and connect with the world. True vitality requires both of these nutrients in abundance. Vital engagement. When love and work are perfectly aligned, they give rise to a state of profound absorption. Consider the lives of extraordinary artists, scientists, and visionaries. They do not merely perform tasks, they are consumed by a passionate relationship with their calling. This journey usually begins with a spark of initial curiosity and enjoyment. Over time, as skills develop and challenges increase, this enjoyment deepens into a state of flow, a seamless, effortless immersion where the boundary between the self and the activity dissolves. The rational rider and the emotional elephant move in perfect unison. Yet a truly fulfilling life requires more than just isolated moments of flow. As an individual grows, their work connects them to a broader community of practitioners, a shared history, and a set of enduring values. This sustained connection matures into vital engagement. It is a relationship to the world that offers both the immediate joy of flow and the enduring weight of profound significance. Cross-level coherence. Human personality is not a single flat entity. It operates across multiple levels. At the base, there are our biological and neurological foundations. Above that are our characteristic adaptations, our specific goals, coping mechanisms, and daily habits. At the highest level sits the life story, the narrative we construct to make sense of our past and guide our future. When these levels are in conflict, when our daily actions betray our deepest values, or when our overarching narrative ignores our biological needs, we experience friction, anxiety, and a sense of being lost. Meaning emerges when these levels are brought into harmony. When what we do aligns perfectly with who we are and the story we tell ourselves, we experience cross-level coherence. This internal alignment feels like a sudden, profound awakening. The fragmented pieces of the self lock into place, and the path forward becomes undeniably clear. God gives us hives. To fully grasp human nature, we must recognize that we are products of two distinct evolutionary pressures. On one hand, we are the descendants of individuals who successfully competed for resources, mates, and status. We possess deep-seated, selfish drives. On the other hand, we are also the descendants of groups that survived because they learned to cooperate, coordinate, and act as a unified whole. We are essentially hive creatures. Just as bees are biologically programmed to function within the swarm, human beings harbor a profound, innate desire to lose themselves in something larger than the self. This is why we find such intense joy in synchronized movements, communal rituals, and the shared fervor of a congregation or a stadium. The spiritual dimension of our psychology is not a mere cultural accident, it is an evolutionary adaptation. We need to connect with the sacred, to transcend the isolated ego, and to feel the majestic rhythm of the hive, harmony and purpose. When we combine these insights, the blueprint for a meaningful life comes into focus. Purpose is not a treasure hidden in a distant land waiting to be unearthed. It is an emergent property. It arises spontaneously when the complex systems of our lives are properly integrated. When the rider of conscious thought respects the emotional elephant. When our daily work engages our deepest strengths, and when our individual lives resonate with the shared heartbeat of our community, a deep sense of harmony is achieved. This harmony bridges the gap between the selfish imperatives of our biology and the noble aspirations of our spirit. Purpose, therefore, is the music that plays when all the instruments of our existence are tuned to the exact same pitch. The meaning of life. The ultimate revelation, the final refinement of our understanding of well-being, is that happiness cannot be obtained by a direct, aggressive pursuit. It cannot be found entirely within, by severing all attachments and retreating into stoic isolation, nor can it be found entirely without, by relentlessly accumulating wealth, status, and external triumphs. The truth is far more delicate. Happiness comes from between. It resides in the dynamic, living spaces between ourselves and the people we love. It is found in the friction and the flow of the work we pour our hearts into. It is discovered in our vital connection to a reality that stretches far beyond the boundaries of our own skin. We must cultivate the right relationships with ourselves, with others, and with our calling, and then simply allow the conditions to work their magic. If we tend the garden well, meaning and happiness will inevitably bloom. Chapter 11. Conclusion. On balance. Humanity has long been intoxicated by the prospect of discovering a single, unifying key to the universe. We are instinctively drawn to the elegance of monism, the belief that all the chaotic complexities of existence can eventually be reduced to one fundamental principle, one ultimate substance, or one infallible rule for living. This drive for singular truth has fueled our greatest scientific triumphs and our most profound religious revelations. Yet, when applied to the messy, multifaceted reality of human psychology and social life, the relentless search for a single, absolute truth often leads to dogmatism and blindness. To genuinely understand the human condition and the architecture of a flourishing life, we must abandon the comfort of monism and embrace a much older, profoundly nuanced framework, the ancient Chinese philosophy of yin and yang. The concept of yin and yang provides a radical departure from the Western tendency to view the world as a perpetual battlefield between the forces of absolute good and absolute evil. In a Manichaean worldview, the ultimate goal is for the light to completely eradicate the darkness. But the yin-yang symbol, a circle divided by a serpentine line into a black tear with a white eye and a white tear with a black eye, represents a universe of dynamic balance. The opposing forces are not enemies, they are indispensable complements. Day requires night, summer requires winter, and the masculine requires the feminine. One cannot exist without the defining contrast of the other. The profound wisdom of this symbol is the recognition that truth is rarely found by completely vanquishing an opposing idea. Rather, truth emerges from the continuous necessary friction between competing perspectives. When we apply this principle of balance to the grand historical conversation about human happiness, the necessity of a profound synthesis becomes undeniable. If we look only to the ancient sages, the Stoics, the Buddha, the ascetics, we receive a masterclass in the mechanics of the internal world. They accurately diagnose the relentless churning of the emotional elephant, the tyranny of the hedonic treadmill, and the suffering generated by our anxious, grasping attachments. Their prescription of inward retreat, cognitive reframing, and spiritual detachment remains an unparalleled tool for managing the inevitable tragedies of existence. However, if we accept this ancient wisdom as the absolute single truth, we end up starving the organism. We sever the vital connections to love, work, and community that modern science unequivocally proves are biologically mandated for our psychological survival. Conversely, if we listen only to the moderns, to the relentless cheerleaders of self-esteem, the architects of consumer capitalism, and the advocates of unrestrained personal autonomy, we receive a recipe for a life rich in external achievements but hollow at its core. The modern perspective brilliantly recognizes our need for environmental mastery and interpersonal connection, but it fatally ignores the inherent flaws of the human mind. Left unchecked, the modern pursuit turns into an endless, exhausting race for relative status, leaving us spiritually bankrupt and highly vulnerable to the crushing weight of our own unmanaged expectations. The ultimate happiness hypothesis, therefore, must be a harmonious integration of both eras. We must fiercely protect the internal citadel of the mind using ancient techniques of reflection and non-attachment, while simultaneously pouring our energies outward into the deep, vulnerable engagements of modern life. We require the yin of the East and the yang of the West. This imperative for balance extends far beyond the individual, offering a vital diagnostic tool for the ideological conflicts that continually threaten to tear modern societies apart. In the political arenas of the contemporary world, the liberal and the conservative frequently view one another through the distorting lens of naive realism and the myth of pure evil. Yet, a society governed exclusively by either extreme would rapidly become uninhabitable. The progressive impulse is the vital advocate for the ethic of autonomy. It is the engine of social justice, constantly working to dismantle oppressive, archaic hierarchies, protect the vulnerable, and expand the radius of human liberty. Without the restless, critical eye of the political left, societies would inevitably stagnate, leaving marginalized individuals crushed under the immense weight of tradition and conformity. However, a society that values nothing but individual autonomy eventually fragments into a hyper-individualistic wasteland of anarchy. This is where the conservative impulse proves its indispensability. The political right intuitively grasps the vital importance of the ethic of community and the ethic of divinity. It understands that human beings are fundamentally hive creatures who require the binding constraints of shared values, moral boundaries, and institutional respect to stave off the chaos of pure selfishness. A flourishing society absolutely requires the progressive foot on the accelerator, driving it forward toward greater equality, and the conservative foot on the brake, ensuring that the essential, life-sustaining structures of the community are not recklessly destroyed in the process. Ultimately, the journey through the landscape of human nature leaves us with a humbling but profoundly liberating realization. There is no secret, singular formula that will miraculously inoculate us against suffering or permanently guarantee our bliss. We are complex, divided creatures, born with an evolutionary inheritance that biases us toward anxiety and hypocrisy, yet equipped with a rational capacity that allows us to recognize and correct these flaws. We are selfish competitors who desperately need the warm embrace of the hive. We are animals bound by biology who possess an undeniable, soaring capacity to perceive the divine. Wisdom is not found in choosing one side of these contradictions and fiercely defending it against all evidence. True wisdom, and the lasting fulfillment it brings, is found in the deliberate, lifelong practice of holding these opposing truths in our minds simultaneously. It is the art of tuning the instruments of our lives, our work, our loves, our internal monologues, and our social obligations, until they resonate in a state of cross-level coherence. The meaning of life is not a final destination to be reached. It is the vital, harmonious balance we continuously strike as we navigate the extraordinary space between ourselves and the world.